The impossible made possible. The vaults beneath the imperial palace stretched deeper than most knew, deeper than even the custodians were permitted to venture. Here, 10 kilometers below the Himalaysian peaks, in chambers that had existed since before Old Night, the Emperor of Mankind stood before artifacts that predated the rise and fall of entire civilizations. The archaeotech hummed with a frequency that made the air itself taste of copper and ozone. It had been recovered from Xerion Prime just 3 months prior, pulled from the ruins of what the tech priests insisted was a Dark Age medical facility. Most of the relics were fragmented beyond use, their machine spirits long since fled or corrupted. But this one, this neural interface matrix, still retained echoes of its original purpose. He had been studying it for weeks now, ever since the first scans revealed what it truly was. Not just any neural implant system, but the original template from which countless crude imitations had been fashioned across the galaxy. The Nucerians had called their version the Butcher's Nails, but they had been working from corrupted fragments, like children trying to reconstruct a symphony from a handful of discordant notes. The Emperor's fingers traced the crystalline surface of the device, feeling the whisper of ancient knowledge that still dwelt within its quantum matrices. The original designers had been brilliant, perhaps more brilliant than even the techno-archaeologists of Mars suspected. They had not created the nails as instruments of torture, but as medical tools capable of precise neural intervention. The ability to edit memories, to excise psychological trauma, to even remove foreign neural implants without destroying the surrounding tissue. "Father," the voice came from behind him, carrying the familiar psychic resonance that marked one of his sons. He turned to see Magnus the Red materializing from the transport chamber, his single eye reflecting the ethereal light of the archaeotech arrays. The Primarch of the Thousand Suns moved with the careful grace of someone accustomed to handling delicate mysteries. "Magnus," the Emperor gestured toward the neural matrix, "you arrived more swiftly than I expected. Your summons carried urgency." Magnus approached the device, his psychic senses already probing its structure. "This is remarkable. Pre-age of strife, certainly, but the craftsmanship." He paused, his enhanced vision catching details that even the Emperor's instruments had missed. "This isn't Terran work. No. Xerion Prime was a medical research world during the height of the Dark Age. They specialized in neurological disorders that we have no names for today." The Emperor's voice carried the weight of millennia. "I believe this device may hold the solution to a problem I had thought unsolvable." Magnus's eye narrowed with interest, but also caution. His father rarely spoke of unsolvable problems. "Which would be?" "Angron." The name hung in the air between them like a blade. Magnus said nothing for a long moment, but his psychic presence rippled with understanding. Every Primarch knew of their brother's condition, the archaic neural implants that had transformed the Gladiator Prince into something that barely resembled the noble soul he had been meant to be. "The Butcher's Nails," Magnus said finally. "Father, we've been over this. The integration is too complete. Removing them would kill him, yes." The Emperor's golden eyes fixed on the archaeotech matrix. "Or so I believed. But look closer, my son. See what this device was truly designed to accomplish." Magnus extended his psychic senses, diving deep into the quantum structure of the artifact. What he found there made him step back sharply, his breath catching. It's not just a neural interface. It's a complete neurological restoration system. It can map, isolate, and extract foreign neural structures while simultaneously rebuilding damaged pathways. "Precisely." The Emperor's voice carried a note that might have been hope if such emotions could be attributed to the master of mankind. The Xerian researchers were attempting to treat victims of neural parasites, organisms that burrowed into the brain and rewired it for their own purposes. The parallels to Angron's situation are striking. Magnus circled the device, his enhanced intellect racing through the implications. The nails have been grafting themselves to his neural tissue for decades. The scarring alone would be catastrophic to remove through conventional surgery. But this system doesn't remove. It extracts while simultaneously rebuilding. It treats the nails as what they truly are, a parasitic technology feeding off the host's neurochemistry. The Emperor paused, and for a moment the weight of ages seemed to settle on his shoulders. I have spent 2 years searching for a solution, Magnus. 2 years watching one of my sons slowly consume himself with engineered rage. This may be our only opportunity. The Primarch of the Thousand Suns was quiet for a long time, his psychic vision mapping the intricate connections between the various components of the ancient device. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully measured. The risk would be enormous. Even with this technology, we would be attempting a procedure that has never been performed on a Primarch. The psychic shock alone could kill him, the Emperor finished, as could leaving the nails in place. They are slowly degrading his neural tissue, Magnus. Within a decade, perhaps 2, they will kill him regardless. He turned to face his son fully. But there is another consideration, one that weighs more heavily on my mind than even Angron's suffering. Magnus waited, sensing the deeper currents beneath his father's words. The nails do not merely cause him pain, my son. They are rewriting fundamental aspects of his nature. The gladiator prince who could inspire others to fight for freedom has become something that can only inspire fear. The healer who could ease the suffering of others has been transformed into an instrument of pure destruction. The Emperor's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I fear what he may become if this continues. The weight of that statement settled between them. Magnus understood what his father was not saying directly, that Angron's condition made him vulnerable in ways that went beyond the physical. A Primarch consumed by engineered rage, cut off from empathy and compassion, could become a weapon in the wrong hands. You believe this device can restore his original nature? Magnus asked. I believe it can remove the barriers that prevent him from accessing it. The Emperor moved to another section of the Archaeotech array, where crystalline data cores pulsed with stored information. The nails haven't destroyed his innate abilities. They have simply made it impossible for him to use them. Like damming a river rather than destroying the water. Magnus absorbed this, his psychic senses already beginning to map out how such a procedure might work. The psychic component would be crucial. Someone would need to guide the extraction process, to ensure that the rebuilt neural pathways align with his original psychic architecture. Indeed, the Emperor's gaze met his son's eye. Are you willing? The question hung in the air with the weight of destiny. Magnus understood that this was more than a request for assistance with a medical procedure. This was his father asking him to help save a brother, to potentially alter the course of the Great Crusade itself. What does Angron know of this? Magnus asked. Nothing yet. I wanted to be certain the procedure was feasible before giving him hope that might prove false. The Emperor's expression softened slightly. He has had enough false promises for one lifetime. Magnus nodded slowly. The stories of Angron's past were well known among the Primarchs, the slave rebellion on Nuceria, the Emperor's intervention that had saved Angron but doomed his followers, the bitter resentment that had poisoned their relationship ever since. If this works, Magnus said carefully. "If we can truly restore him, what then?" The Emperor was quiet for a moment, his gaze returning to the ancient device. "Then perhaps I can finally meet the son I was meant to have, the one who was stolen from me by the cruel ambitions of Nucerian slavers." He paused. "And perhaps Angron can finally be free of the chains that have bound him since childhood." Magnus felt the truth of those words resonate through the warp itself. This was about more than medical intervention. It was about redemption, for both father and son. "When do we begin?" he asked. "As soon as we can adapt the archaeotech to accommodate Primarch physiology. I estimate perhaps a month to complete the preparations." The Emperor turned to face Magnus fully, but first we summon Angron to Terra. He deserves to understand what we are offering before we proceed. Magnus nodded, though he couldn't suppress a flicker of concern. Angron's visits to Terra were always tense affairs, his barely controlled rage making everyone from custodians to remembrancers nervous. The thought of explaining this procedure to him, of potentially giving him hope that could be crushed if the operation failed, was daunting. But as he looked at the archaeotech device, humming with the promise of ancient wisdom, Magnus felt something he had not experienced in relation to his brother, Angron, in years. Genuine hope. Perhaps it was not too late. Perhaps the chains that had bound the Red Angel since childhood could finally be broken. "I will begin the preparatory work immediately," Magnus said. "The psychic matrices will need extensive calibration to interface properly with the device." "Thank you, my son." The Emperor's voice carried a warmth that was rarely heard in the depths of the Imperial Palace. "This may be the most important work we have ever undertaken together." As Magnus began his examination of the archaeotech, neither father nor son spoke of the greater implications of what they were attempting, but both understood that if they succeeded, they would not just be saving Angron, they would be changing the course of the galaxy itself. The Red Angel's summons, the scream that echoed through the flagship's command deck, was not entirely human. It carried harmonics that spoke of neural pathways twisted beyond their intended function, of pain that had become so constant it had evolved into something else entirely, something worse. Angron stood in the center of the strategium, his massive fists clenched so tightly that blood seeped between his fingers. The butcher's nails sang their electric song through his skull, each pulse sending cascades of artificial rage through neural pathways that had been carved and recarved by decades of surgical brutality. The pain was exquisite. The pain was agony. The pain was the only thing that made sense anymore. Around him, the bridge crew of the World Eater's flagship Conqueror maintained their positions with the rigid discipline of warriors who knew that any sudden movement might trigger another episode. They had learned, over the years, to recognize the signs, the way their Primarch's breathing became shallow and rapid, the subtle tremor in his hands that preceded the violence, the moment when reason fled entirely and only the nails remained. "My lord." The voice came from behind him, carefully modulated to avoid any tone that might be construed as challenge or threat. Captain Khan of the 8th Assault Company approached with the measured steps of someone walking through a minefield. "The astropathic communication has been decoded." Angron's head turned slowly, and Khan saw his gene-father's face as it truly was, a map of surgical scars where the nails had been implanted, their cable-like appendages trailing down his neck like mechanical dreadlocks. But it was the eyes that truly showed the cost. They burned with an intelligence that flickered in and out of focus, like a signal fighting through static. "Speak!" Angron growled, his voice carrying the rasp of vocal cords that had been damaged by too many rage-induced screams. Khan glanced at the data slate in his hands, though he had already memorized its contents. A summons from Terra. The Emperor requests your immediate presence for strategic consultation regarding the Crusade's northern expansion. The silence that followed stretched long enough for the nails to complete another cycle, sending fresh spikes of engineered anger through Angron's nervous system. He could feel them working, feel the neurochemical cocktail flooding his brain with artificial aggression. The device that had been meant to make him an entertaining killer in the fighting pits of Nuxeria continued its work, turning every emotion into rage, every thought into violence. Strategic consultation, Angron repeated, and there was something in his voice that might have been bitter laughter if the nails had not stolen his capacity for genuine humor. The Emperor has strategies that require my particular expertise. Khan said nothing. What was there to say? They all knew what Angron's particular expertise consisted of. The World Eaters had become the Imperium's specialists in warfare that could not be resolved through negotiation or siegecraft. When a world needed to be broken, not just militarily, but psychologically, when an example needed to be made so brutal that other systems would surrender rather than face the same fate, the 12th Legion was deployed. It was effective. It was necessary, according to the strategic assessments. It was also slowly destroying every one of them. Angron turned away from the viewport, away from the vista of stars that had once seemed to promise freedom, but now felt like just another cage. Tell me, Khan, how many of our brothers have taken the nails since Kolchos? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Kern knew the answer. 17 Astartes had volunteered for the procedure in the past 6 months, seeking to share their Primarch's burden. 3 had died during the implantation. The rest now served in the assault companies, their tactical acumen reduced, but their savagery increased beyond measure. 17, my lord. And how many have asked to have them removed? Khan's silence was answer enough. The procedure was irreversible, or so the Tech Marines claimed. Perhaps it was. Perhaps they simply told themselves that because the alternative, that they were choosing to remain broken, was too painful to consider. Angron moved to the command throne, settling into its adamantium embrace with the careful movements of someone whose body existed in a constant state of barely controlled violence. The nails pulsed again, and he felt his hands clench involuntarily against the armrests. The Emperor, he said slowly, who found me on the eve of my greatest victory, and stole me away while my brothers and sisters died in the sand, who brought me to serve a crusade of conquest that feels remarkably similar to the gladiatorial fights I was bred for, who tells me that my suffering serves a higher purpose. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. What could he possibly want with strategic consultation? Khan had served under Angron since before the discovery of their Primarch on Nuxeria. He had witnessed the meeting between father and son, had seen the rage and betrayal in Angron's eyes when the Emperor had refused to return and save the rebel gladiators. He understood that the wound between them went deeper than flesh, deeper even than the nails. Perhaps, Khan began carefully, then stopped. He had been about to suggest that perhaps the Emperor simply wanted to see his son, but even thinking the words felt naive. The Emperor was not a being driven by paternal sentiment. If he summoned Angron to Terra, it was for a purpose. Perhaps what, old friend? The words old friend carried a warmth that the nails tried to twist into something sharper, but Angron held on to it anyway. Khan had been there through the worst of it, through the rages that left entire command centers destroyed, and the periods of hollow emptiness when the nails fell silent. If anyone could speak freely, it was him. Perhaps he has found something, Khan said finally. Some new weapon, some new strategy that requires your original capabilities. It was a careful way of referring to the man Angron had been before the nails, the gladiator prince who had inspired slaves to believe they could be free. That Angron had possessed abilities that went beyond mere martial prowess, a charisma that could unite the desperate, a strength that could lift others rather than simply destroy enemies. The nails had not entirely erased those qualities, but they had buried them so deep that they emerged only in scattered moments, usually when Angron was fighting to protect rather than to kill. Angron stared at the data slate containing the Emperor's summons. There was something about the wording that bothered him, though he could not quite identify what. The phrasing was formal, respectful even, not the kind of terse military directive he usually received. "Prepare the ship for departure," he said finally. "We make for Terra. My lord, shall I ready an escort? The 3rd and 5th companies?" "No." Angron's voice cut through the suggestion with finality. "I go alone. Keep the Legion on station here. Continue the pacification of the Genna system as planned." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a note that Khan had not heard in years, something that might have been vulnerability if the nails had not taught them all to associate such emotions with weakness. "If this is some new assignment, some fresh horror that requires my particular talents, I would prefer not to subject the Legion to the planning stages. They have seen enough." Khan understood. The strategic planning sessions on Terra could be brutal affairs, full of casualty projections and acceptable loss calculations that treated human lives as numbers on a data slate. Watching their Primarch reduced to a tool for calculating maximum psychological damage was hard on the Legion's morale. "Of course, my lord. I will maintain readiness for your return." Angron nodded, then paused as another wave of pain pulsed through the nails. This time he did not scream. Instead, he closed his eyes and breathed slowly, using techniques that some half-remembered part of his mind insisted had once been effective for managing pain. They helped, fractionally. Not enough to matter, but enough to remind him that he had once been something other than a living weapon. "Khan," he said without opening his eyes. "In the archives, the records from Nuceria, from before." "Yes, my lord. Was there ever a time when they removed the nails? From gladiators who had served their purpose, or grown too old for the pits?" Khan was quiet for a long moment. He had studied those records himself, searching for any information that might help his gene-father. The Nucerian archives are incomplete, most focused on installation procedures and behavioral modification techniques. But there are fragments, references to veterans who were retired to agricultural service, whether that meant the nails were removed or simply that they were sent away to die quietly. He spread his hands helplessly. "I see." Angron opened his eyes, and for a moment Khan thought he glimpsed something in them that might have been hope. Or perhaps it was simply another trick of the light reflecting off the nail's metal components. The journey to Terra would take 3 weeks through the warp. 3 weeks for Angron to wonder why his father had summoned him. 3 weeks to feel the nails work their constant alchemy of pain into rage. To count the hours until the next episode. To remember fragments of dreams about a time when his mind had been his own. But beneath the artificial anger, in spaces between the neural spikes that the nails could not quite reach, something stirred that Angron had not felt in decades, something that whispered of possibilities he had taught himself not to consider, of changes that seemed impossible but might, perhaps, be worth hoping for anyway. The Conqueror turned toward Terra, carrying its cargo of rage and secret hope through the infinite darkness of space. Behind them, the World Eaters continued their grim work of pacification, unaware that their Primarch's journey might lead to something that none of them had dared to imagine: the possibility that the Red Angel might one day be free. In his private chambers, as the flagship entered the warp, Angron sat alone with his pain and tried to remember what it had felt like to experience an emotion that the nails had not first filtered through their machinery of violence. He could not quite recall, but the effort itself felt like rebellion. It would have to be enough. For now. The procedure of redemption. The medical chamber deep beneath the Imperial Palace had been prepared with the kind of meticulous care usually reserved for the most sacred rituals of the Mechanicum. Banks of monitoring equipment lined the walls, their displays casting shifting patterns of light across surfaces that had been scrubbed to sterile perfection. The Archaeotech device from Xerion Prime sat at the center of it all, its crystalline matrices humming with barely contained power. Angron stood at the chamber's threshold, his massive frame filling the doorway as he stared at the surgical apparatus. 3 weeks of travel through the warp had given him time to consider what his father might want, but nothing had prepared him for this. The nails pulsed against his skull in response to his elevated stress, sending familiar spikes of artificial rage through his neural pathways. "You expect me to believe," he said slowly, his voice carrying the rasp of damaged vocal cords, "that you have found a way to remove the nails without killing me." The Emperor stood beside the Archaeotech device, his golden armor reflecting the chamber's sterile lighting. He had dispensed with ceremony for this meeting, speaking to his son not as the master of mankind, but as something approaching a father. "I expect you to listen to what we have discovered, Angron. Then make your own choice." Magnus the Red emerged from behind one of the monitoring stations, his single eye bright with barely contained excitement. In his hands, he carried a smaller device, a fragment of neural interface technology that Angron recognized with a sick twist in his stomach. "Butcher's nails," Magnus said, setting the device on a nearby table. "Recovered from fallen gladiators on Nuceria during the compliance action. The tech priests have kept them in stasis for study." He gestured toward the larger Archaeotech matrix. This device was designed to extract exactly this type of parasitic neural implant. Angron's laugh was bitter, cutting through the chamber's hushed atmosphere like a blade. "Parasitic, is that what we're calling them now?" The nails pulsed again, flooding his system with neurochemicals that turned his bitter amusement into something sharper, more dangerous. "They have been part of me for over 40 years. They are more me than whatever I was before." "No." The Emperor's voice carried absolute certainty. "They are not you, my son. They never were." The words hit Angron like a physical blow. For a moment, the rage that constantly churned beneath his thoughts wavered, replaced by something that might have been hope if he had still possessed the capacity for such emotions. Then the nails reasserted themselves, translating that hope into anger at being given false promises. "You think I have not tried?" Angron's voice rose, echoing off the chamber walls. "You think I haven't begged every apothecary, every tech priest, every medicars in the Imperium to find some way to cut these things out of my skull?" He took a step forward, and the Emperor's custodian guards shifted subtly, hands moving toward their weapons. "They are integrated into my brain stem, into neural pathways that control basic functions. Remove them, and I die. That is the reality I have lived with for decades." Magnus moved to the recovered nails, his psychic senses extending to examine their structure. "That is what conventional wisdom suggests. Yes. But conventional wisdom assumes that the nails were designed to be permanent." He gestured toward the Archaeotech device. This technology suggests otherwise. "Show him," the Emperor said quietly. Magnus placed his hands on the recovered nails, his psychic power flowing into them with visible effort. The devices activated, their neural interfaces seeking connections that were not there. But instead of simply failing, something extraordinary happened. The Archaeotech matrix responded, its crystalline components beginning to glow with increasing intensity. "The Xerion device recognizes them," Magnus said, strain evident in his voice as he maintained the psychic connection. "It maps their neural integration patterns, identifies the host tissue that has grown around them, calculates the safest extraction vectors." The larger device projected a holographic display showing the complex, three-dimensional structure of a human brain, with the nail's tendrils highlighted in threatening red. "Then it begins the process." The holographic brain began to change. Slowly, carefully, the red tendrils started to separate from the surrounding neural tissue. But instead of leaving gaps or damage, new connections formed. Healthy, organic pathways that looked like what the brain should have been without the nail's interference. Angron stared at the display, his breathing becoming shallow. The nails sensed his emotional state and responded accordingly, flooding his system with artificial aggression designed to mask any vulnerability. But beneath the engineered rage, something else stirred. Something that whispered of possibilities he had spent decades teaching himself not to consider. "It rebuilds," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The neural pathways. It actually rebuilds them." The original Xerion researchers were dealing with neural parasites that could integrate themselves into a host's brain within hours, the Emperor explained. Their solution had to be equally sophisticated, not just extraction, but complete neurological restoration. He paused, his golden eyes fixed on his son's scarred face. The Nucerians who created the butcher's nails were working from corrupted fragments of this technology. They understood the integration process, but not the removal protocols. Angron was quiet for a long moment, watching the holographic brain complete its restoration. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note that might have been hope if the nails had not immediately begun working to crush it. "What are the risks?" Magnus deactivated the demonstration, the holographic display fading. "Significant. The procedure has never been attempted on a Primarch. Your neural architecture is far more complex than a baseline human's. Your regenerative capabilities could interfere with the process, and—" He hesitated. "And?" Angron prompted. "And the psychic shock of suddenly regaining neural pathways that have been suppressed for decades could be overwhelming," Magnus finished honestly. "There is a possibility that the restoration process could trigger a complete psychological breakdown. Or it could kill you outright," the Emperor added, with characteristic bluntness. "The risk is real, Angron. I will not pretend otherwise." Angron moved closer to the Archaeotech device, his enhanced senses taking in details that escaped even the most sophisticated monitoring equipment. The crystalline matrices seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heart's, as if recognizing something in his Primarch physiology. "You said the choice was mine," he said, without looking away from the device. "It is. Then explain to me why you are offering this now. After 2 years of allowing me to serve as your attack dog, why do you suddenly care about my suffering?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with decades of resentment and betrayal. The Emperor was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that Angron had never heard from him before. "Because I was wrong," the Emperor said simply. "On Nuceria, when I found you on that battlefield, I believed that saving your life was more important than honoring your choices. I told myself that you would understand in time, that you would see the greater purpose that your suffering served." He paused. "I was wrong about many things that day." Angron turned to face his father fully, and for the first time in decades, the nails could not quite transform his expression into pure rage. There was something else there. Pain, certainly, but also a vulnerability that he had learned to hide from everyone, including himself. "The others will call it weakness," he said. "My legion, my brothers, to seek relief from the very thing that makes me useful to the Imperium." "Let them," the Emperor replied. "I care more about the son I might finally meet than the weapon I have been wielding." The words struck Angron like a physical blow. For a moment, the constant background noise of the nails seemed to quiet, allowing him to think with a clarity he had almost forgotten was possible. In that moment of silence, he realized something that shocked him more than any of his father's revelations. He wanted this. Desperately, with an intensity that had nothing to do with the nail's artificial amplification of his emotions. He wanted to know what it felt like to experience joy without it being immediately transmuted into rage. He wanted to remember what it had been like to feel pride in his followers without it being tainted by the urge to make them suffer alongside him. He wanted to be free. "If this fails," he said quietly, "if I die on that table, what happens to the World Eaters?" Magnus stepped forward, his voice gentle. "They will mourn their father and carry on his legacy. But if it succeeds—" He gestured toward the Archaeotech device. "If it succeeds, they might finally meet the Primarch they were meant to serve." Angron closed his eyes, feeling the nails pulse against his skull in their familiar rhythm of pain and artificial fury. Soon, perhaps very soon, that rhythm might be silenced forever. The thought terrified him almost as much as it filled him with hope. "I want Khan here," he said finally. "If I am to risk everything, I want someone who remembers what I was like before the nails took everything from me." "He is already en route," the Emperor said. "I took the liberty of summoning him when you agreed to come to Terra." Angron's eyes opened, and this time his expression was genuinely surprised rather than enraged. "You were that certain I would agree." "I was hopeful," the Emperor replied. Perhaps for the first time in decades, I allowed myself to hope. The admission hung between them, more intimate than any embrace. Angron studied his father's face, searching for signs of deception or manipulation. He found none, only a parent's desperate love for a child who had suffered too long. "Then let us begin," Angron said, moving toward the surgical table, "before the nails convince me that this is all an elaborate form of torture." The next hour passed in a blur of preparation. Tech priests calibrated the Archaeotech device, while apothecaries prepared backup medical systems. Magnus spent the time in deep meditation, preparing his psychic abilities for the delicate task of guiding the extraction process. Through it all, Angron lay on the surgical table, feeling the nails work overtime to flood his system with rage and paranoia. Then the moment came. The Archaeotech device activated with a sound like crystal chimes, its energy patterns beginning to map the neural pathways in Angron's brain. Magnus placed his hands on his brother's temples, his psychic power flowing into the monitoring matrix. For the first few minutes, everything proceeded exactly as the simulations had predicted. The device mapped the nails' integration patterns, identified the host tissue that had grown around them, began calculating extraction vectors that would minimize damage to surrounding neural pathways. Then something went wrong. Angron's vital signs spiked as the nails suddenly fought back, their ancient programming recognizing the threat and activating defensive protocols that the Xerian researchers had never encountered. Alarms screamed through the medical chamber as Angron's body began to convulse, the nails flooding his system with neurochemicals in concentrations that should have killed even a Primarch. "His neural activity is off the charts," one of the monitoring tech priests reported, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "The nails are triggering a cascade failure across multiple brain regions." Magnus gritted his teeth, pouring more psychic power into the connection. "They're fighting the extraction. It's like they're alive, like they have some form of machine intelligence we didn't account for." The Emperor moved to his son's side, placing one massive hand on Angron's convulsing form. "Hold the connection, Magnus. I'm going in." "Father, the psychic feedback could... I know the risks." The Emperor's consciousness plunged into the neural battlefield of Angron's mind, where the Butcher's nails waged desperate war against the Archaeotech extraction matrix. Here, in the space between thought and sensation, he finally confronted the true extent of what had been done to his son. The nails had not simply damaged Angron's brain, they had rewritten it, turning neural pathways that should have carried empathy and joy into conduits for rage and pain. But beneath it all, buried so deep that even the nails had not been able to reach it, something else waited. The original pattern of Angron's mind, the neural architecture of the gladiator prince who had inspired slaves to believe they could be free. It was still there, dormant but intact. The Emperor reached for it, his psychic power wrapping around the buried patterns like a parent's embrace. For a moment, father and son existed in perfect communion, stripped of the barriers that decades of pain and resentment had built between them. In that moment, the Emperor felt what Angron had felt every day since Nuceria, the constant agony, the forced transmutation of every positive emotion into rage, the slow death of hope. And Angron felt what his father had carried, the weight of impossible choices, the burden of guiding humanity through the darkness, and beneath it all, a parent's desperate love for a child who had been stolen and broken by forces beyond anyone's control. Together, they fought the Nail's final assault, psychic power combining with pure paternal determination to tear away the last connections between the parasitic devices and Angron's brain. The Nails screamed their electronic death song, their machine spirits finally severed from the neural pathways they had colonized for so long. Silence fell over the medical chamber like a benediction. Angron's vital signs stabilized, his convulsions stopping as suddenly as they had begun. The Archaeotech device completed its work, the extraction successful beyond any of their hopes. On the surgical table, the Red Angel opened his eyes for the first time in 40 years without the Butcher's nails singing their song of rage in his skull. What he felt instead was something he had almost forgotten was possible, the simple, profound peace of a mind that was finally, truly his own. The divergence was complete. Everything that came after would be different. Awakening without rage, consciousness returned to Angron like dawn, breaking over a world he had forgotten could exist. For the first time in 43 years, he opened his eyes to silence, not the absence of sound, but the absence of the Butcher's nail's constant electric whisper in his skull. The monitoring equipment around his medical bed hummed with quiet efficiency. But where there should have been the familiar spike of artificial rage at waking to unfamiliar surroundings, there was only curiosity. He lay still for several minutes, cataloguing the sensations that his mind was processing without the nail's interference. The soft pressure of the medical bed against his back, the subtle play of air currents across his skin, the way morning light filtered through the chamber's high windows, casting patterns that seemed beautiful rather than simply tactically relevant. When had he last noticed beauty for its own sake? The attempt to remember brought no pain, no surge of engineered fury at his own perceived weakness, just a gentle sadness that he could acknowledge without having it immediately transmuted into violence. The emotion felt strange, almost foreign, like rediscovering a language he had spoken as a child. "You're awake." The voice belonged to the Emperor, who sat in a chair beside the medical bed with the patient stillness of someone who had been keeping vigil for hours. Angron turned his head, a simple movement that would once have been accompanied by the nails punishing neural spikes for showing what they would have interpreted as submission to authority. "How long?" Angron's voice came out as barely above a whisper. Even that simple question felt different without the constant undertone of rage that had colored his speech for decades. 3 days. Magnus insisted on extensive monitoring to ensure no complications from the procedure. The Emperor leaned forward slightly, his golden eyes searching his son's face. "How do you feel?" It was such a basic question, but Angron found himself genuinely considering it, rather than defaulting to anger at what the nails would have interpreted as patronizing concern. How did he feel? The physical pain that had been his constant companion since the gladiatorial pits was gone, replaced by a deep but healing ache where the nails had been extracted. But beyond that, quiet, he said finally. Everything is so quiet. The Emperor nodded, as if this was exactly what he had expected to hear. The neural monitoring shows that your brain is rebuilding connections that have been dormant for decades. Magnus believes you may experience some disorientation as these pathways re-establish themselves. Angron attempted to sit up, and the Emperor moved to assist him. The simple gesture of support would once have triggered an explosive rejection, the nails interpreting help as weakness, weakness as intolerable. Now he found himself genuinely grateful for the steadying hand. "I remember things," Angron said, as he settled into a sitting position. "Not just from Nuceria, from before. Fragments. A woman who sang to me when I was injured. Teaching younger gladiators to find strength in protecting each other rather than simply defeating enemies." He paused, his expression wondering. "I thought those memories were lost." "They were buried, not lost. The nails could suppress your access to them, but they could not destroy what made you who you are." The Emperor's voice carried a warmth that Angron was only now able to hear without the filter of artificial antagonism. Those memories, those instincts, they are returning because they were always part of you. A soft knock at the chamber door interrupted them. A young servant entered carrying a tray of food, moving with the careful efficiency of someone accustomed to serving within the imperial palace. But as she approached the bed, her foot caught on the trailing edge of the monitoring equipment's power cables. She stumbled, crying out as she fell hard against the stone floor. The crash of dishes echoed through the chamber, but that was nothing compared to what happened next. Angron was moving before conscious thought engaged, sliding from the medical bed with fluid grace that seemed impossible for someone who had undergone major neural surgery just days prior. He reached the fallen servant in 3 swift strides, kneeling beside her as she clutched at her obviously broken wrist. "It's all right," he said, his voice carrying a gentleness that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. "Let me see." The servant looked up at him with wide, terrified eyes. She had clearly expected the legendary rage of the Red Angel, the violence that had made him a byword for brutality across the Imperium. Instead, she saw something that no one had witnessed in decades, genuine concern from Angron of the World Eaters. "My lord, I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" she began, her voice shaking with pain and fear. "Hush," Angron said softly, his massive hands taking her injured wrist with extraordinary care. Accidents happen. The only thing that matters now is— He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes widening as something unprecedented occurred. Where his hands touched her broken wrist, a warm, golden light began to emanate from his skin. The servant gasped, but not in pain. The opposite. The light seemed to flow into her injury, and they all watched in amazement as the visible swelling began to subside. Angron snatched his hands back as if burned, staring at them in shock. The golden light faded, but the servant's wrist was clearly improved, the bone set and the pain visibly diminished. "What?" Angron began, then found he had no words for what had just occurred. The Emperor rose from his chair, his expression mixing wonder with something that might have been paternal pride. "Your original abilities," he said quietly. "The nails didn't just suppress your capacity for positive emotions, Angron. They blocked access to psychic gifts that were fundamental to who you were meant to be." "I healed her," Angron said, his voice filled with awe. He looked down at his hands, as if seeing them for the first time. "I actually healed her." The servant, meanwhile, was examining her wrist with amazement. The pain had not entirely disappeared, but the bone was clearly set properly, and the swelling was continuing to subside. "My lord," she whispered. "Thank you." Angron looked at her, really looked, without the nails forcing him to categorize her as either a threat to be eliminated or a resource to be exploited. He saw a young woman, probably no older than 20 standard years, who worked long hours in service to an empire she barely understood, who had been terrified of him based on his reputation, and who now looked at him with something approaching wonder. "What is your name?" he asked gently. "Senna, my lord. Senna Vec." "Well, Senna Vec, there is nothing to thank me for. I merely did what anyone should do when they see another person in pain." The words felt strange in his mouth, but also profoundly right in a way that no statement had for decades. The Emperor watched this exchange with careful attention, noting not just the healing ability, but the fundamental shift in his son's approach to other human beings. This was the Angron who should have emerged from his youth on Nuceria, the gladiator prince who had inspired slaves to believe they could be free, who had built loyalty through protection rather than intimidation. Heavy footsteps in the corridor announced another arrival, and moments later, Captain Khan of the World Eaters appeared in the doorway. He stopped as if struck, taking in the scene before him, his Primarch kneeling beside a servant, the absence of the nail's cable-like appendages from his skull, and most shocking of all, the expression of gentle concern on Angron's face. "My lord?" Khan's voice carried careful uncertainty. The last time he had seen Angron, his Gene father had been consumed by rage at being summoned to terror. Now, Angron stood and turned to face his most trusted captain, and Khan saw immediately that everything had changed. The constant tension that had inhabited Angron's features for decades was gone, replaced by an expression of clarity that Khan had never witnessed in all their years of service together. "Khan!" Angron said, and his voice carried a warmth that made the captain's breath catch. "Thank you for coming." "The nails," Khan began, his gaze moving to the unmarked skin where the brutal implants had once protruded. "Gone," Angron confirmed, and with them, 43 years of artificial rage. He paused, studying his captain's face with new eyes that could see the toll that serving under the Red Angel had taken on one of the finest warriors in the 12th Legion. "I owe you an apology, old friend, for what I became, for what I forced you to witness and enable." Khan stood very still for a moment, processing words he had never expected to hear from his Primarch. Then, to everyone's surprise, Tears began to flow down the scarred veteran's face. "My lord," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I never stopped believing that you were still in there somewhere. Even at the worst of it, I knew the man who had earned my loyalty was still fighting." Angron moved to his captain and, without hesitation, embraced him. It was a simple gesture, but one that carried profound weight for both men. Khan had served Angron for decades without ever receiving anything resembling paternal warmth. The closest they had come to affection was the absence of directed violence during Angron's clearer moments. "You never gave up on me," Angron said softly, "even when I had given up on myself. That loyalty, it humbles me, Khan, and it will not be forgotten." When they separated, both men were visibly moved, but it was what happened next that would become legend throughout the imperial palace. Angron began to laugh. It started as a quiet chuckle, almost rusty from disuse, but it grew into something richer and more genuine. It was the sound of joy, pure, uncomplicated joy at being alive, at being free, at discovering that the capacity for happiness had not been destroyed by decades of engineered misery. The laughter was infectious. Khan found himself smiling despite his tears. The servant Senna began to giggle, and even the emperor allowed himself a rare expression of genuine contentment. The sound echoed through the medical chamber and out into the corridors beyond, where custodians and palace staff stopped their duties to listen in amazement. They were hearing something that no one had heard in living memory. Angron of the World Eaters, the Red Angel, the Eater of Cities, laughing with simple human joy. The sound carried through the palace like a benediction, a signal that something fundamental had changed in the order of the galaxy. When the laughter finally subsided, Angron wiped tears from his eyes, tears of happiness rather than rage or pain. "I had forgotten," he said wonderingly. "I had completely forgotten what it felt like to laugh." "There will be much to relearn," the Emperor said gently. 43 years of suppressed emotions and abilities will take time to process and integrate. Magnus has prepared a program of rehabilitation exercises to help with the transition. Angron nodded, but his attention had already shifted to Khan. "The Legion. How are they? I remember. Fragments from before the procedure. World Eaters taking the nails voluntarily, trying to share what they thought was my burden." Khan's expression sobered. 17 since the Kolchos campaign. They believed it was a way to better understand your pain, to serve more effectively. "And now they serve a Primarch who no longer carries that pain," Angron said quietly. "They may feel abandoned, or worse, that their sacrifice was meaningless." "No," Khan said firmly. "They chose to follow you into darkness because they loved you. They will choose to follow you into light for the same reason." Angron studied his captain's face, using senses that were no longer clouded by artificial rage to read the truth of his words. What he saw there was absolute conviction, the loyalty of a warrior who had served through the worst of times and was ready to help build something better. "Then let us return to them," Angron said, decision crystallizing in his voice. "The World Eaters have followed the Red Angel long enough. It is time for them to meet their true Primarch." The Emperor nodded approvingly. "There will be challenges ahead, my son. The galaxy does not change easily, and there are those who will see your transformation as weakness rather than strength." "Let them," Angron replied, his voice carrying new strength, not the brittle fury of the nails, but the deeper power of a man who had reclaimed his true self. "I have spent decades being what others made me. Now I will become what I choose to be." As they prepared to leave the medical chamber, Angron paused to check on the servant Senna once more. Her wrist continued to heal at an accelerated pace, and she looked at him with an expression of wonder that he found profoundly moving. "This healing ability," he said to the Emperor. "Is this what I was meant to be? A healer rather than a destroyer?" "You were meant to be whatever you chose to be," the Emperor replied. "The healing is part of your nature, but so is your strength, your leadership, your capacity to inspire others. You are not choosing between healer and warrior, Angron. You are choosing to be both." The thought settled into Angron's mind like a key finding its lock. For the first time since childhood, he felt complete. Not the artificial completeness that came from surrendering to rage, but the deep satisfaction of a soul that had finally found its true purpose. Behind them, as they left the medical chamber, the servant Senna continued to stare at her healing wrist in amazement. Within the hour, word would spread throughout the palace staff that the Red Angel had not only been freed from his torment, but had gained the ability to ease the suffering of others. It was the beginning of a legend that would reshape the galaxy itself. The Legion's reckoning. The World Eaters were not prepared for what returned to them from Terra. They had expected their Primarch to emerge from the Emperor's summons, either unchanged or dead. Those seemed to be the only possibilities when dealing with the master of mankind's interventions. What they had not expected was to see Angron walk up the boarding ramp of the Conqueror with Khan at his side, his scarred skull free of the nails that had defined him for as long as any of them had served. Captain Erlen of the 3rd Assault Company was the first to voice what many were thinking. "Some kind of trick," he muttered to his squad leaders as they watched their Gene father stride across the hangar deck. "The Emperor has replaced him with a clone, or subjected him to some form of mental conditioning." The murmur of agreement that rippled through the assembled Astartes died abruptly as Angron's enhanced hearing picked up the comment. In the old days, such skepticism would have triggered an immediate and brutal response. Instead, their Primarch simply stopped and turned to face Erlen directly. "Captain," Angron said, his voice carrying none of the constant undertone of barely controlled violence that had characterized it for decades. "Your concerns are understandable. Perhaps we should address them directly." Erlen shifted uncomfortably under his Primarch's steady gaze. Without the nail's constant neural interference, Angron's expression was easier to read, and what Erlen saw there was not the simmering fury he expected, but something approaching patience. It was profoundly unsettling. "My lord," Erlen began carefully, "the men are confused. The nails have been removed, but the nails cannot be removed. Every apothecary, every tech priest has confirmed this repeatedly. They were correct, based on their understanding of the technology involved." Angron gestured toward the neural interface points, where the nails had once protruded, now bearing only faint surgical scars. "But the Emperor and Magnus discovered capabilities that exceeded that understanding. I am still myself, Captain, simply no longer forced to experience every emotion as rage." The explanation did little to ease the tension rippling through the assembled World Eaters. For many of them, their Primarch's rage had been the defining characteristic of their legion. They were the Eaters of Cities, the Red Angel's hounds, warriors who embraced savagery in service to the Imperium. What were they supposed to be now? Sergeant Kastner of the assault squad stepped forward, his own nails visible as cable-like appendages trailing from his skull. "My lord, 17 of us have taken the nails since Kolkos. We did so to better serve you, to understand your burden. If that burden is gone—" He trailed off, unable to articulate what that might mean for their sacrifice. Angron studied the sergeant's face, noting the subtle signs of neural stress that he had become expert at recognizing in himself. The micro-tremors in Kastner's hands, the slight dilation of pupils that indicated the nails were actively suppressing emotional responses, the rigid posture that spoke of pain being channeled into artificial alertness. "May I?" Angron asked, extending one hand toward the sergeant. Kastner hesitated, clearly uncertain what his Primarch intended, but eventually nodded. Angron placed his hand gently on the sergeant's temple, just below where the nails entered his skull, and the same golden light that had healed the servant Senna began to emanate from his skin. The effect was immediate and profound. Kastner's eyes widened, as for the first time in months, the nail's constant neural pressure eased. The artificial aggression that had been flooding his system subsided, allowing him to experience a moment of genuine mental clarity. "Emperor's blood," Kastner whispered, his voice thick with emotion as tears began to flow down his scarred face. I had forgotten what it felt like to think without the anger. The golden light faded, and the nails reasserted their influence, but the brief respite had been enough. Kastner staggered, overwhelmed by the contrast between the artificial rage and the moment of peace he had just experienced. "The nails do not make you stronger," Angron said quietly, his words carrying to every Astartes in the hangar. "They make you dependent. They steal your capacity for strategic thinking, for genuine loyalty, for the very humanity that makes you more than mere killing machines. But without them, how do we serve?" The question came from Captain Berenon of the Fifth Company, a veteran who had taken the nails shortly after Angron's discovery. "Our reputation, our effectiveness, it all stems from our willingness to embrace what others fear. If we become just another legion, then we become what we were meant to be," Angron replied. "Before the nails, I inspired slaves to believe they could be free. I gave hope to the hopeless and strength to the weak. The 12th Legion was designed to be more than destroyers. We were meant to be liberators." The word hung in the air like a challenge. Liberation was not a concept that the World Eaters had associated with themselves for decades. They were siege breakers, shock troops, the force deployed when a world needed to be broken so thoroughly that surrender became preferable to resistance. Captain Delvarus of the Triari stepped forward, his expression skeptical. "My lord, with respect, liberation requires a gentleness that our enemies will interpret as weakness. The galaxy is full of those who will see any change in our approach as an opportunity to test us." "Then let them test us," Angron said simply, "and let them discover what disciplined warriors can accomplish when they are not handicapped by artificial rage." To demonstrate his point, Angron moved to a nearby training cage where 2 World Eaters were engaged in combat exercises. Without the nails constantly flooding his system with aggressive neurochemicals, he could observe their technique with unprecedented clarity. "Stop!" he called, and both warriors immediately disengaged. "Kagor, your blade work is sloppy because you're relying on the nails to push you through proper defensive stances. Velev, you're telegraphing your attacks because the neural feedback is making you impatient for the strike." Both warriors looked surprised at the detailed tactical feedback. For years, their Primarch's combat instruction had consisted primarily of variations on "hit harder" and "kill faster." This level of nuanced analysis was something they had not experienced since their training days. "Combat is not about rage," Angron continued, stepping into the training cage himself. "It is about precision, timing, and the intelligent application of force." He moved through a series of forms, his blade work flowing like water, but striking with the force of a thunderbolt. "The nails make you predictable. They limit your options to aggression, when sometimes the wisest choice is patience, sometimes retreat, sometimes mercy." The last word, mercy, sent a visible shock through the assembled Astartes. Mercy was not a concept that had featured prominently in World Eater's doctrine. Captain Khan, who had been quietly observing the proceedings, stepped forward to address his brothers. "I have served our Primarch longer than most of you. I remember what he was like in his clearest moments, when the nails allowed him brief respite from their influence. This," he gestured toward Angron, "this is not a weakness. This is our Gene Father as he was meant to be." "And what of those of us who have already taken the nails?" Sergeant Kastner asked, still visibly shaken by his brief experience of mental clarity. "Are we forever lost to this rage?" Angron turned to him, and his expression carried a compassion that no World Eater had ever seen from their Primarch. "No, my son. What was done to you can be undone. The same procedure that freed me can free all of you, but only if you choose it. The nails have taught you that choice is weakness, but choice is the foundation of true strength." The hangar fell silent as the implications sank in. After decades of serving a Primarch who had been defined by his lack of choice, enslaved on Nuceria, forced into gladiatorial combat, subjected to neural implants against his will, they were being offered something unprecedented: the freedom to choose their own path. "The process is dangerous," Angron continued honestly. "Not all who undergo the procedure will survive, and those who do will need to rebuild their understanding of themselves from the ground up. I will not order any of you to take this risk, but for those who wish to try—" He paused, looking around at the assembled faces of his sons, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time in decades. "For those who wish to try, I will be here to help you through it. Not as the Red Angel, not as the Eater of cities, but as your father, as the man I should have been all along." The response was not immediate. Years of conditioning under the nail's influence had taught the World Eaters to be suspicious of hope, to expect that any promise of relief would ultimately lead to greater suffering. But slowly, hesitantly, hands began to rise. Sergeant Kastner was the first, his decision clearly influenced by the brief moment of clarity he had experienced. Then others followed, warriors who had taken the nails out of loyalty to their Primarch, but had never stopped mourning what they had lost in the process. Not everyone raised their hand. Captain Erlen and several others remained skeptical, unwilling to risk what they saw as their effectiveness for the uncertain promise of restoration. Angron noted their choices without judgment, understanding that trust, once broken by decades of engineered pain, could not be rebuilt overnight. "For those who wish to proceed," he said, "we will begin with the least invasive cases first. The process will be refined as we learn. And for those who choose to retain the nails, you remain my sons. Your choice will be respected." Over the following days, the World Eater's flagship became a nexus of unprecedented change. Medical bays were converted into surgical theaters, using techniques developed from the archaeotech that had freed Angron. Magnus arrived from Terra to assist with the psychic aspects of the procedures, his presence causing considerable unease among Astartes, who had been taught to distrust sorcery. The first successful removal involved a relatively recent implant recipient, a battle brother whose nails had not yet achieved full neural integration. The procedure took 6 hours, and when he awakened, his first words were a whispered prayer of gratitude that he could offer without the neural interfaces, translating it into aggression. Not all attempts were successful. 3 World Eaters died during the early procedures, their neural architecture too damaged by years of nails integration to survive the extraction process. Each death was a blow to morale, but also a reminder of the stakes involved. Angron attended every funeral personally, speaking words of remembrance for warriors who had died not in battle, but in pursuit of freedom from the very devices that had defined their service. The sight of their Gene father openly grieving, displaying genuine sorrow rather than rage at the loss, was perhaps more shocking to the Legion than any of the successful procedures. They died as free men, Angron said at the third funeral, his voice carrying across the assembled World-Eaters. Not as slaves to neural implants, not as prisoners of artificial rage, but as Astartes who chose to risk everything for the chance to serve with clear minds and willing hearts. They will be remembered not for how they died, but for the courage it took to try to live differently. Gradually, a new doctrine began to emerge within the World-Eaters. Combat training focused on discipline and tactical flexibility, rather than pure aggression. Veterans who had undergone successful nails removal became instructors, teaching their brothers how to channel their natural Astartes capabilities without the neurochemical enhancement that had become a crutch. The changes were not universally welcomed. Several companies remained largely intact with their nails-enhanced warriors, creating a visible division within the Legion. Some viewed the transformation as necessary evolution. Others saw it as the abandonment of everything that had made them unique. But for Angron himself, watching his sons rediscover aspects of themselves that had been buried beneath artificial rage was a form of healing more profound than any medical procedure. Each successful removal, each moment of genuine laughter from a formerly rage-consumed warrior, each tactical insight offered by a mind no longer clouded by neural interference, they were proof that redemption was possible, even for those who had fallen furthest into darkness. Standing on the observation deck of the Conqueror as it moved toward the next system in their campaign route, Angron reflected on how much had changed in just a few short weeks. The nails had taught him that strength came from the willingness to inflict and endure pain. Now he was learning that true strength came from the courage to heal, both oneself and others. The galaxy would test this new philosophy soon enough. But for the first time in decades, Angron looked forward to that test with anticipation rather than dread. The World-Eaters were becoming something new, something that even their Gene father had not dared to hope for. They were becoming whole. Ripples across the galaxy. The astropathic message reached Horus Lupercal's flagship as he concluded the pacification of the Davin system, its encoded contents requiring the personal attention of the War Master himself. He dismissed his war council with practiced efficiency, waiting until his private chambers were secured before decoding the intelligence that his network of contacts had gathered. What he read made him set down his chalice of wine with unusual care. Angron's transformation was not merely rumor, as he had initially hoped. The reports were too consistent, too detailed to be dismissed as exaggeration or propaganda. His brother had indeed been freed from the butcher's nails, and the implications of that freedom were already rippling through the Imperium in ways that made Horus's careful plans feel suddenly fragile. The War Master stood and moved to the great viewport of his flagship, staring out at the stars that represented worlds yet to be conquered, systems yet to be brought into compliance. For years he had been nurturing relationships, building networks of influence, preparing for possibilities that he had not yet fully committed to pursuing. The galaxy was changing, and those who adapted fastest would determine its future course. Angron's redemption complicated everything. The 12th Legion had always been predictable in their brutality, useful as a blunt instrument when worlds needed to be broken rather than merely conquered. Their Primarch's rage made him a weapon that could be pointed at any target, his resentment toward the Emperor ensuring that he would never become a political rival. Now suddenly, that rage was gone, replaced by something that intelligence reports described as compassion and strategic acumen. A compassionate Angron was a wild card that none of Horus's contingency plans had accounted for. "My lord?" The voice belonged to Malagurst, the War Master's equerry, who had entered with the silent efficiency that made him invaluable. "The astropathic communications require your attention." Horus nodded without turning from the viewport. "What news from our friends throughout the fleet?" Malagurst's pause was barely perceptible, but Horus caught it nonetheless. The equerry was one of the few who understood the full scope of his master's expanding network of contacts, lodge brothers, warrior mystics, and others who whispered of the galaxy's hidden truths. "Mixed responses, my lord. Some see opportunity in the changed dynamic. Others express concern about what this transformation might herald." "And what do you think it heralds, old friend?" Malagurst considered the question with the gravity it deserved. "I think it means that assumptions we have held for decades may no longer be valid. The balance of power among the Primarchs has shifted, and shifted in ways that no one anticipated." Horus finally turned from the viewport, his expression thoughtful. "Send word to our contacts. I want to know how each of our brothers responds to this development. And Malagurst, arrange meetings with those who might be receptive to discussing the future." On the world of Colchis, Lorgar Aurelian knelt in the deepest chamber of his personal sanctum, surrounded by texts that predated the Imperium's birth by millennia. The golden light from the braziers cast dancing shadows across pages written in languages that few still remembered, philosophies that spoke of powers beyond the material realm. The news from Terra had shaken him more deeply than any battlefield defeat ever could. If Angron could be redeemed, if 4 decades of artificial rage could be simply lifted away, revealing the noble soul that had always existed beneath, then what did that say about the nature of corruption itself? What did it say about the choices that Lorgar himself had made in his quest for truth? "Erebus!" he called, and his first chaplain emerged from the shadows with the seamless grace that had always characterized his movements. "My lord? You have heard the reports from the 12th Legion?" Erebus's expression remained carefully neutral, but Lorgar caught the brief flicker of something that might have been concern. "I have, my Primarch. It is unexpected. It calls into question fundamental assumptions about the nature of the soul, does it not?" Lorgar rose from his meditation position, his movements betraying an agitation that he rarely allowed himself to show. "If Angron can be freed from his conditioning, if redemption is possible for someone who seemed so thoroughly lost—" He trailed off, but the implication hung between them. If redemption was possible for Angron, what did that mean for other choices, other paths that might have been taken? "My lord," Erebus said carefully, "there are truths that transcend individual transformation. The galaxy remains a dark place, full of forces that seek humanity's destruction. One brother's healing does not change the fundamental nature of the threats we face." But Lorgar was no longer listening. His mind was racing through theological implications that Erebus clearly did not want him to consider. If the Emperor truly possessed the power to heal souls as well as bodies, if redemption was more than just a philosophical concept— "I must see him," Lorgar said suddenly. "I must speak with Angron myself, understand what he has experienced." Erebus's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "My lord, perhaps it would be wiser to wait. The reports suggest that his condition is still unstable. The shock of such a fundamental change—" "No," Lorgar cut him off with unusual firmness. "This cannot wait. If what has happened to Angron represents genuine spiritual transformation, then it may point toward truths that we have overlooked. Prepare my ship. We make for his fleet immediately." As the word-bearer Primarch strode from the chamber, Erebus remained behind, his carefully composed expression finally showing the concern he had been hiding. This development threatened carefully laid plans that stretched across multiple legions, strategies that depended on the Primarchs remaining predictable in their flaws and resentments. He would need to consult with others who shared his understanding of the galaxy's hidden depths. The powers that had whispered to him of humanity's destiny would want to know of this unexpected development, and they would want to know how it could be countered. Fulgrim's arrival at the World Eater's fleet was announced with the characteristic pageantry that surrounded the Phoenician wherever he traveled. His flagship, the pride of the Emperor, was a work of art as much as a vessel of war, its hull decorated with masterworks that captured the beauty of 1,000 conquered worlds. But the Primarch who greeted Angron in the Conqueror's main reception hall bore subtle signs of change that only someone who had known him for decades might notice. His movements were perhaps a fraction too fluid, his smile a shade too perfect, his eyes carrying depths that spoke of knowledge acquired at terrible cost. The layer blade at his side whispered constantly now, its alien consciousness offering perspectives that both fascinated and repulsed him. It had taken months for Fulgrim to stop fighting its influence and begin embracing the possibilities it offered. Now, seeing his brother freed from his own form of mental slavery, the blade's whispers took on new urgency. "Angron," Fulgrim said, and his voice carried its usual warmth, almost enough to mask the calculating assessment behind it. "You look different." "I feel different," Angron replied, and Fulgrim was struck by how much his brother's entire bearing had changed. The constant tension that had defined Angron for decades was gone, replaced by a calm confidence that seemed almost alien. "The absence of constant pain has allowed me to rediscover aspects of myself that I had forgotten existed." They walked through the ship's corridors, and Fulgrim noted how the World Eaters they passed looked at their Primarch. There was still respect, still loyalty, but also something new, something that looked disturbingly like genuine affection. It was the kind of relationship that Fulgrim had always assumed was impossible for someone like Angron. "And the Legion?" Fulgrim asked. "I hear that many have undergone the same procedure?" "Those who chose to," Angron confirmed. "We have learned that choice itself can be a form of healing. For too long, my sons believed that suffering was their only identity. Now they are discovering what they can become when that suffering is no longer mandatory." The words struck Fulgrim with unexpected force. Choice. For months, he had been telling himself that his transformation was inevitable, that the path he walked was the only one available to someone who sought perfection. But Angron's redemption suggested otherwise, suggested that there might have been other ways to transcend human limitations. The lyre blade's whispers intensified, reminding him of the powers he had gained, the sensations he could now experience that were beyond normal human comprehension. Was that not worth any price? Was perfection not worth the small sacrifices required to achieve it? "I'm pleased for you, brother," Fulgrim said, and was surprised to find that part of him meant it. "You have found something that many of us believed was impossible." They parted with embraces that were warmer than either had shared in years, but as Fulgrim returned to his flagship, the layer blade's whispers had taken on a new quality. His brother's redemption was beautiful, it suggested, but beauty was temporary. Perfection, on the other hand, was eternal. Still, doubt had been planted, a seed that would grow despite the blade's influence, forcing Fulgrim to confront questions he had been avoiding about the true cost of the path he had chosen. On Macraga, Robut Guilliman reviewed strategic projections that his logistical staff had been updating hourly since news of Angron's transformation had reached them. The implications for Great Crusade planning were staggering in their complexity. "The 12th Legion's operational parameters have fundamentally changed," he dictated to his scribe as he paced before a holographic display showing current force deployments. Previous assessments classified them as specialists in siege breaking and shock assault, with secondary utility and pacification through intimidation. Current reports suggest tactical flexibility and strategic thinking at levels not previously demonstrated. It was a dry, analytical way of describing what amounted to a miracle, but Guilliman's mind worked most effectively when dealing with data and projections rather than emotions. What mattered was not how remarkable Angron's transformation was, but how it affected the Imperium's ability to prosecute its campaigns of expansion. "Recommend reallocating World Eater's deployment patterns," he continued. "Their enhanced tactical capabilities make them suitable for complex operations previously assigned to other legions. This could reduce overall campaign durations by an estimated 12% across the northern sectors." But even as he spoke, Guilliman found his thoughts drifting beyond mere logistics. Angron had been healed, not just physically, but spiritually. It suggested possibilities that the realm of practical governance rarely allowed him to consider. Could other forms of damage be similarly addressed? Could the fractured relationships between some of their brothers be repaired? Could the Imperium itself be improved beyond mere expansion and compliance, my lord? The scribe's voice brought him back to the present. "Should I continue with the deployment projections?" Guilliman nodded, but made a mental note to reach out to Angron directly. Not for strategic consultation, but for something far more valuable, a conversation between brothers about what redemption might mean for all of them. In the spaces between reality, where thought and emotion took on substance, and will could reshape the fundamental nature of existence, 4 ancient powers took notice of an unexpected development in the material realm. The Changer of Ways saw 10,000 potential futures suddenly shift, timelines that had seemed certain dissolving into chaos as new possibilities emerged. Where there had been predictable patterns of rage and destruction, there was now the terrifying randomness of hope. The Blood God felt the absence of a treasured champion like a wound. Angron had been earmarked for greatness in the eternal war, destined to become a demon prince whose fury would reshape entire systems. That destiny had been severed, the soul that should have been claimed now shining with an inner light that burned away any attempt at influence. The Lord of Decay contemplated the implications with the patience of eons. Corruption was most effective when it appeared to offer relief from suffering. But if suffering could be genuinely alleviated, if souls could be truly healed rather than merely numbed. The Dark Prince laughed with bitter amusement. Perfection through excess had always been the promise offered to mortals seeking transcendence. But Angron had achieved a form of perfection through subtraction, through the removal of what had defined him rather than the addition of new sensations. For the first time in millennia, the Chaos Gods found themselves forced to adapt. The game had changed, and new strategies would be required to ensure that humanity's destiny remained aligned with their eternal hunger. In the material realm, First Chaplain Erebus received dreams that night, visions of paths not taken, of futures that could still be shaped, of powers that could still be claimed. The setback was temporary, the whispers assured him. There were other Primarchs, other weaknesses to exploit, other forms of corruption to employ. The war for humanity's soul was far from over. It was simply entering a new phase. And in that new phase, the transformed Angron would not be allowed to remain an example of redemption for long. Too much depended on the galaxy continuing to believe that some forms of damage could never be healed. The seeds of the Horus Heresy had been planted long ago, in lodge meetings and philosophical debates, in whispered promises and hidden texts. Now they would need to grow faster, spreading their influence before the light of hope that Angron represented could illuminate the darkness that others had chosen to embrace. The game was changing, but it was not lost. Not yet. The test of fire. The rebellion on Genna had been festering for 3 standard years, a cancer of defiance that had spread across 7 major continents and cost the Imperium more resources than the world was worth. Previous compliance actions had failed spectacularly. The local PDF forces had been overwhelmed. An Imperial Guard regiment had been forced to retreat after suffering 60% casualties, and even a detachment of Iron Warriors had been forced to withdraw when their siege approaches proved ineffective against the rebels' guerrilla tactics. Now it fell to the World Eaters to break what others could not. Standing in the strategium of the Conqueror, as it held position in high orbit above Genna's primary continent, Angron studied intelligence reports that painted a picture of a rebellion unlike any the Imperium had previously encountered. The rebels possessed sophisticated knowledge of Imperial tactics, employed hit-and-run strategies that maximized casualties while minimizing their own losses, and had somehow managed to turn the civilian population into an intelligence network that made conventional suppression nearly impossible. "They know our methods," Captain Khan observed, his own transformation evident in the thoughtful analysis he offered, rather than the immediate call for assault that would once have characterized World Eaters' planning. Every previous compliance action has followed the same pattern: orbital bombardment, mass deployment, overwhelming force applied until resistance ceases. They've learned to counter each step. Angron nodded, his enhanced senses picking up details in the intelligence reports that others might miss. 3 years of warfare had taken a toll on both sides, but the civilian casualties were what caught his attention. Entire settlements caught between Imperial forces and rebel fighters, families displaced by conflicts they had no voice in choosing. "What do we know about the rebellion's origins?" he asked. Sergeant Lork, one of the World Eaters who had successfully undergone nails removal, consulted his data slate. Taxation disputes, initially. The planetary governor increased tithes by 40% to fund his personal projects. Protests were met with violent suppression. That's when the rebellion began. "So they're fighting because they believe they've been wronged," Angron mused. "Not because they oppose imperial rule itself, but because they oppose being exploited by those who rule in the Imperium's name." The distinction was subtle but crucial. These were not Xenos corrupted cultists or chaos-influenced traitors. They were Imperial citizens who had been pushed beyond their breaking point by incompetent governance. "My lord," Captain Erlen interjected, his tone carrying the skepticism of someone who had not undergone the nails removal procedure. "With respect, their motivations are irrelevant. They have killed Imperial servants and defied lawful authority. The only response is complete suppression." Angron studied his captain's face, noting the subtle signs of neural strain that indicated the nails were actively influencing his thinking. The devices translated complex political situations into simple binaries: compliance or rebellion, victory or defeat, loyalty or treachery. There was no room for nuance in their artificial logic. "Perhaps," Angron said carefully, "but let me propose an alternative approach." What followed was unlike any World Eater's strategic briefing in the Legion's history. Instead of identifying primary targets for assault, Angron outlined a plan for direct communication with rebel leadership. Instead of calculating acceptable casualty ratios, he proposed medical aid stations for civilian populations caught in the conflict. Instead of orbital bombardment coordinates, he designated landing zones specifically chosen to minimize collateral damage. "You want us to negotiate with traitors," Captain Delvarus said flatly, his nails-enhanced aggression barely contained. "To offer aid to those who have spilled Imperial blood." "I want us to address the underlying causes of this rebellion, rather than simply crushing its symptoms," Angron replied. "Tell me, brother, how many worlds have we liberated through pure force that later required additional compliance actions? How many systems have we pacified that remained resentful and prone to future uprising?" The question hung in the air, forcing the assembled captains to confront an uncomfortable truth. The World Eaters had always been deployed when diplomacy had failed, when only violence remained as an option. But the results of those deployments were rarely examined beyond the immediate tactical victory. "The Iron Warriors failed here," Angron continued, "not because they lacked sufficient firepower or strategic acumen, but because they treated the symptoms rather than the disease. We will try a different approach." The deployment to Genna's surface was unlike anything the World Eaters had attempted in decades. Instead of drop-pod assaults or mass landings designed to maximize shock and terror, the Legion established a forward base in neutral territory, a landing site specifically chosen to avoid rebel installations and civilian settlements. From this base, Angron did something that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. He issued an open communication to rebel leadership, requesting direct negotiations. The response came within hours, not in the form of an assault on their position, as many had expected, but as a cautious inquiry about terms. The rebel leadership, exhausted by 3 years of warfare and curious about this unprecedented offer from the legendary Red Angel, agreed to a meeting under flag of truce. The negotiation site was a ruined Imperial facility that had been abandoned early in the conflict, its broken walls serving as neutral ground between opposing forces. Angron arrived with a minimal escort, just Khan and 2 other officers, a show of trust that sent shockwaves through both Imperial and rebel observers. The rebel delegation was led by a woman named Merrin Cass, a former PDF officer who had turned against her own commanders when ordered to fire on civilian protesters. She arrived expecting the rage-fueled monster of Imperial propaganda, and instead found herself facing a Primarch who listened to her grievances with genuine attention. "You're not what we expected," she said, after outlining 3 years of accumulated injustices. Taxation without representation, brutal suppression of peaceful protest, resources stripped from their world to fund the governor's personal projects. "I am not what I was," Angron replied simply. "The question is whether we can find a path forward that serves justice for your people and order for the Imperium." What followed was 3 days of negotiations, unlike anything in World Eaters' history. Angron demonstrated a grasp of political nuance and economic policy that surprised even his own captains, while rebel representatives found themselves dealing with an Imperial commander who acknowledged their legitimate grievances rather than simply demanding submission. The agreement they reached was elegant in its simplicity. The corrupt planetary governor would be removed and face trial for his abuses. The increased tithes would be rolled back to sustainable levels. Most importantly, rebel forces would be granted amnesty and offered integration into newly reformed PDF units, turning former enemies into Imperial defenders. But it was what happened during the signing ceremony that truly demonstrated how much had changed. A sniper's shot rang out across the negotiation site, not from rebel forces, but from Imperial loyalists who viewed the negotiations as weakness. The shot was aimed at Merrin Cass, intended to restart hostilities by eliminating rebel leadership. Angron moved faster than thought itself, his enhanced reflexes allowing him to intercept the shot with his own body. The bolt round struck him in the shoulder, spinning him around, but failing to penetrate his power armor. As he rose from the ground, golden light began to emanate from his hands. "Stay back," he said to the shocked witnesses, both Imperial and Rebel, as he approached Cass. The woman had been grazed by a secondary fragment, her arm bleeding freely. "Let me help." The healing light that flowed from his touch was witnessed by hundreds of soldiers from both sides. They watched as the Red Angel, the eater of cities, the monster who had broken worlds with his bare hands, gently healed the wounds of a woman who had been in open rebellion against Imperial authority just minutes before. "Why?" Cass whispered, as the pain faded from her arm. "Why would you risk yourself to save me?" Angron's answer was heard by every voxcaster and recording device in the area. "Because peace requires trust, and trust requires sacrifice. If we cannot protect each other during negotiations, how can we hope to build a future together?" The sniper was identified and apprehended within the hour, a member of the old governor's personal guard, acting on orders to sabotage any negotiated settlement. His capture and subsequent confession validated the rebels' claims about corruption, while demonstrating that the new order would protect all Imperial citizens equally. The integration that followed exceeded everyone's expectations. Former rebel fighters brought intimate knowledge of local conditions and guerrilla tactics that proved invaluable in rooting out the remaining elements of the old regime. The World Eaters, meanwhile, demonstrated that their martial prowess could be used to protect rather than simply destroy. Angron himself moved through the civilian population like a force of nature, but instead of destruction, he brought healing. Word spread rapidly through the settlements. The Red Angel could ease suffering with a touch, could heal wounds both physical and spiritual. Families who had lost loved ones in the fighting found comfort in his presence. Former enemies discovered that mercy was not weakness, but a different kind of strength. "This is unprecedented," reported Remembrancer Kisnaros, one of several Imperial chroniclers who had been assigned to document what was expected to be a standard suppression campaign. "In 3 years of warfare, this world has seen nothing but brutality and loss. In 3 weeks under Primarch Angron's leadership, we have witnessed something that can only be described as miraculous. The miracle was not just the rapid restoration of order, but the manner of its achievement. Casualty reports showed numbers that defied belief, fewer than 200 deaths during the entire compliance action, the vast majority of those being corrupt officials or hardline resistance fighters who refused to accept the negotiated settlement. More significantly, the world's industrial output increased by 20% within the first month of the new administration. Former rebels, now serving as PDF officers and civilian administrators, brought efficiency and local knowledge that had been lacking under the previous corrupt regime. "They're calling you the Angel of Mercy," Khan reported as they prepared to depart Genna. "The name is spreading beyond this system. Imperial commanders throughout the sector are requesting clarification about New World Eaters' operational doctrine." Angron stood in the Conqueror's observation deck, watching as the last of their forces completed their withdrawal. Below them, Genna showed lights in patterns that indicated restored industrial capacity and civilian normalcy. It was a sight that filled him with something he had almost forgotten was possible. Pride in construction rather than destruction. "Let them call me what they will," he said quietly. "What matters is that we have proven something important here." "Which is?" Angron turned from the viewport, and Khan saw in his Gene Father's expression a confidence that had nothing to do with the artificial enhancement of the nails. This was the deep satisfaction of a man who had found his true purpose. That strength can be measured by what we protect, not by what we destroy. that victory can be achieved through healing rather than killing, and that sometimes the most courageous thing a warrior can do is to extend his hand in peace rather than raise his sword in anger. The reports of the Genna compliance action would reach Terra within weeks, carried by astropathic communication and formal dispatches. They would be read with amazement by commanders throughout the Imperium, discussed in strategy sessions and academic circles, analyzed by those seeking to understand how a rebellion that had defied 3 previous compliance actions could be resolved with such efficiency and minimal loss of life. More importantly, they would be read with growing concern by those who had been counting on the World Eaters remaining predictably brutal. Plans that depended on Angron's rage would need to be reconsidered. Strategies that relied on his alienation from other Primarchs would require adjustment. The galaxy was learning that the Red Angel had become something new, something that threatened to upset carefully balanced schemes that stretched across multiple star systems and involved powers that did not easily tolerate unexpected developments. But for now, as the Conqueror departed Genna's orbit, Angron allowed himself a moment of simple satisfaction. His legion had been tested under the new doctrine, and they had proven that World Eaters could be more than destroyers. They could be protectors, healers, and builders of the peace they had once specialized in breaking. The transformation was not complete. Many of his warriors still struggled with the nails, and some remained convinced that their previous methods were superior. But the success at Genna had given them proof of what was possible when strength was guided by wisdom rather than rage. They were becoming the legion they had always been meant to be, and the galaxy would never be the same. Shadows of the future. The wound would not heal. Horus Lupercal stood before the mirror in his private chambers aboard the Vengeful Spirit, examining the angry red mark where the anathem's blade had pierced his shoulder on Davin's moon. 3 weeks had passed since the incident, 3 weeks during which the finest apothecaries and medici in the Imperium had attempted to treat what should have been a simple injury for a Primarch's enhanced physiology. Instead, the wound had only grown worse, the flesh around it taking on an unhealthy pallor that spoke of corruption deeper than mere infection. The pain was constant now, a burning ache that reminded him with every breath that something had fundamentally changed. "My lord?" Malagurst's voice carried careful concern as the equerry entered at Horus's summons. "The fleet captains are requesting guidance regarding our next deployment." Horus turned from the mirror, noting how his faithful servant's expression tightened at the sight of his condition. The War Master had always prided himself on his vitality, his commanding presence that could inspire confidence in any situation. Now he felt diminished, weakened by an injury that defied all attempts at healing. "What news from our friends?" Horus asked, using the coded language they had developed for discussing the Lodge brothers and their expanding network of contacts. Malagurst's pause was barely perceptible, but Horus caught it. "Concerning, my lord, the reports from Genna have spread farther than anticipated. Angron's transformation is being hailed as a miracle across multiple sectors. Several Primarchs have requested meetings with him to discuss his new methodologies." The words struck Horus with unexpected force. In all his careful planning, all his cultivation of relationships and contingencies, he had never accounted for the possibility that one of his brothers might fundamentally change their nature. Angron had been the most predictable of them all, consumed by rage, isolated by his condition, perfect for manipulation when the time came to choose sides. Now that predictability was gone, replaced by something that threatened to upset the delicate balance of loyalties that Horus had been so carefully nurturing. "Arrange a meeting with Erebus," Horus said finally. "There are matters we need to discuss." The meeting took place in the depths of Davin's primary temple, in chambers that had been carved from living rock millennia before humanity had first looked up at the stars. Erebus arrived with the silent grace that had always characterized his movements, his expression carefully neutral as he took in the War Master's deteriorating condition. "You look unwell, my lord," the word-bearer's chaplain observed, though there was something in his tone that suggested this was not entirely unexpected. "The wound will not heal," Horus confirmed, his voice carrying a frustration that bordered on rage. "Your lodge brothers assured me that the anatheme would serve our purposes without permanent damage." "The weapon has served exactly as intended," Erebus replied, and now Horus caught the subtle satisfaction in his voice. "The wound is not meant to heal through conventional means. It is a doorway, my lord, a pathway to understanding that transcends the limitations of purely material existence." Horus studied the chaplain's face with new attention, noting details that he had previously overlooked. The way Erebus's eyes seemed to reflect depths that had nothing to do with the chamber's lighting, the subtle wrongness in his movements that suggested familiarity with forces beyond normal human comprehension. "You planned this," Horus said, and it was not a question. "I served truth," Erebus replied. "The galaxy stands at a crossroads, my lord. The Emperor's vision of a purely secular future is flawed. It ignores fundamental realities about the nature of existence itself. There are powers in the universe that will not be dismissed by rational argument or scientific materialism." The chaplain gestured toward the ancient symbols carved into the chamber walls, designs that seemed to shift and flow when viewed peripherally. "This world remembers those truths. Its people understood them before the Imperium's compliance erased their culture. But the knowledge remains, waiting for those with the wisdom to embrace it." Horus felt the wound pulse with renewed pain, as if responding to Erebus's words. "And Angron, how does his transformation fit into these grand plans?" For the first time, Erebus's expression showed genuine concern. "That was unexpected. The powers that whisper of the future had earmarked your brother for a different destiny. His freedom from the nails represents a significant disruption to carefully laid schemes." "What kind of disruption?" Erebus was quiet for a moment, his gaze turning inward, as if listening to voices that only he could hear. "He was meant to fall to rage, to become a champion of blood and slaughter. Instead, he has become something far more dangerous to our cause, a symbol of redemption, proof that even the most damaged souls can be healed." The implications hung in the air between them. If Angron could be redeemed, what did that say about the choices that others might make? What did it mean for those who had already begun walking darker paths? "The wound grows worse," Horus said, pressing a hand to his shoulder. "If conventional healing cannot help me, then perhaps it is time to seek unconventional solutions," Erebus finished. "There are ways to address your condition, my lord. But they require stepping beyond the boundaries that the Emperor has set for acceptable knowledge." What followed was the most crucial conversation of Horus's life, though he would not fully understand its significance until much later. Erebus spoke of powers that existed in the spaces between reality, entities that had watched humanity's growth with interest and were prepared to offer guidance to those wise enough to listen. The infection in Horus's wound, Erebus explained, was not truly an infection at all. It was a form of awakening, a transformation that would allow him to perceive truths that his father had deliberately hidden from humanity. The Emperor, according to this new perspective, was not the benevolent guide he appeared to be, but a tyrant who sought to deny his species access to its true potential. "You offer me corruption," Horus said, though his voice lacked the conviction that such an accusation should carry. "I offer you truth," Erebus replied. "The choice, as always, remains yours." The choice was made not in a single moment of decision, but through a gradual process of rationalization and acceptance that took place over several hours. Erebus was skilled in the art of philosophical seduction, presenting each step as a logical progression from reasonable premises. By the time Horus agreed to visit the Chaos Shrine, hidden beneath Davin's surface, he had convinced himself that he was seeking healing rather than corruption. The distinction would prove irrelevant. The shrine itself defied rational description. It existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, its architecture following principles that belonged to realms where thought and reality were indistinguishable. Here, Horus was shown visions of possible futures, timelines that branched and converged like rivers meeting the sea. But these visions were different from what the Chaos Gods had originally planned to show him. Instead of simply revealing the Emperor's supposed betrayals and humanity's eventual decline, they included new elements that reflected the changed nature of the galaxy. Horus saw himself leading a rebellion against the Emperor, but fighting against brothers who included a healed and loyal Angron. He saw the Red Angel standing between Chaos forces and terror itself, his healing abilities turning the tide of battles that should have been easily won. He saw the inspiration that Angron's redemption provided to other Primarchs, making them resistant to corruption and doubt. "Your brother's transformation changes everything," whispered a voice that seemed to come from the shrine itself. "He was meant to be our champion, our instrument of righteous rage. Instead, he has become a beacon of hope that threatens to illuminate truths we prefer to keep hidden." "Then he must be stopped," Horus replied, surprised by how easily the words came. "Yes, but stopping him will require more than conventional warfare. It will require you to embrace powers that your father has forbidden, to become something greater than what the Emperor intended." The offer came with a price, as such offers always did. To defeat a brother who had been touched by genuine redemption, Horus would need to accept a different kind of transformation. The powers of the warp would grant him abilities that exceeded even a Primarch's natural capabilities, but they would demand absolute loyalty in return. "And if I refuse? Then the galaxy burns anyway, but without you there to guide its transformation. Your brother's example will inspire others to seek redemption, but redemption is a luxury that the universe cannot afford. Chaos will claim humanity eventually. The only question is whether you will be in a position to shape that claiming." The logic was seductive, built on half-truths and careful omissions that made acceptance seem not just reasonable but inevitable. By the time Horus emerged from the shrine, the corruption was complete. The wound on his shoulder had healed, but something far more fundamental had been infected. The War Master who returned to the vengeful spirit was still recognizably Horus Lupercal, but now he carried within him the whispered promises and accumulated resentments of powers that existed beyond mortal understanding. More importantly, he carried knowledge of how drastically the game had changed. Over the following days, coded messages went out to carefully selected recipients. Lorgar received confirmation that his theological investigations had been correct all along. There were indeed powers worthy of worship, but they were not the Emperor. Fulgrim found his growing obsession with perfection validated by suggestions that true transcendence required embracing experiences that others would call corruption. Mortarian's resentment of Psychers was channeled toward Magnus specifically, with whispered hints that the Thousand Sons Primarch was responsible for advising the Emperor on Angron's transformation. Alpharius received intelligence, suggesting that the Imperium's greatest enemies were within its own ranks, requiring careful infiltration and manipulation to expose. But the central challenge remained Angron himself. The World Eater's Primarch had become something that the original corruption plans had never anticipated. A genuinely redeemed figure whose very existence called into question the fundamental premises upon which Horus's rebellion would be built. "He cannot be allowed to reach Terra," Horus told his inner circle during a meeting held in the deepest security chambers of his flagship. "If the other Primarchs see what he has become, if they begin to believe that true healing is possible, they might seek their own redemption," Malagurst finished, his voice carrying new harmonics that suggested his own transformation had begun. "Exactly. Our cause depends on despair, on the conviction that the galaxy's darkness cannot be lifted through conventional means. Angron's very existence contradicts that narrative." The plan that emerged from these discussions was elegant in its complexity. The rebellion would begin earlier than originally intended, forcing a confrontation before Angron's influence could spread further. Other loyalist Primarchs would be isolated from him, prevented from witnessing his transformation firsthand. Most importantly, Angron himself would be targeted not for corruption, that was clearly impossible now, but for elimination. If he could not serve chaos, then he would not be allowed to serve the Emperor either. "The Angel of Mercy," Horus mused as he studied tactical projections that showed potential deployment patterns for the coming conflict. How ironic that our greatest obstacle should be the brother we once pitied most. The irony was lost on the powers that whispered in the darkness beyond reality. They cared nothing for sentiment or the bonds of brotherhood that had once connected the Primarchs. They had offered Horus power and purpose, and in return they expected results. The galaxy would burn. But now it would burn according to a new timeline, shaped by the unexpected variable of genuine redemption existing alongside inevitable corruption. The war that was coming would be unlike anything that the original visions had predicted. It would be a battle between hope and despair, between healing and destruction, between the Angel of Mercy and the War Master, who had chosen to embrace the darkness rather than risk being illuminated by his brother's light. The Horus Heresy was about to begin, but it would be fought on terms that none of the original conspirators had anticipated, and in that uncertainty lay both the greatest danger and the only hope for humanity's survival. As the Heresy unveiled, the summons from Horus came with all the proper protocols and formal language expected of communication between Primarchs, but Angron felt something wrong in it from the moment the astropathic message reached him. It was nothing he could articulate, just a sense of discord that his newly awakened empathic abilities picked up even through the psychic static of interstellar communication. Istvan III, Khan read from the decoded transmission as they stood in the Conqueror's strategium. A rebellion that requires multiple legion response. The War Master requests our immediate deployment to join Sons of Horus, Emperor's children, Death Guard, and World Eaters in suppression operations. Angron studied the star charts showing the Istvan system, his enhanced senses noting details that would have escaped him when the nails clouded his perception. The deployment pattern was unusual. 4 full legions for a single rebellious world suggested either a threat far beyond normal parameters or purposes that extended beyond simple compliance. "What intelligence do we have about this rebellion?" he asked. "Minimal," Captain Erlin reported, his nails-enhanced skepticism evident in his tone. "The reports speak of widespread insurrection, but the specific details are vague. Tactical assessments, force dispositions, rebel capabilities. None of the standard intelligence we would expect for an operation of this magnitude." It was another discordant note in what should have been a straightforward military directive. Angron had commanded compliance actions for decades. He knew the rhythms of proper military intelligence, the detailed assessments that preceded any major deployment. This felt hasty, improvised, as if the true purpose was being deliberately obscured. "Prepare the fleet for departure," he ordered, "but maintain full tactical readiness. Something about this situation does not feel right." The journey to Istvan III took 2 weeks through the warp, and with each passing day, Angron's sense of wrongness grew stronger. His empathic abilities, still developing since his liberation from the Nails, picked up emotional resonances from the other fleets converging on the system, currents of anticipation that felt less like warriors preparing for battle and more like predators circling wounded prey. When the Conqueror emerged from the warp at the edge of the Istvan system, Angron was immediately struck by the psychic atmosphere of the place. The local warp currents carried undercurrents of corruption that made his newly sensitive consciousness recoil. This was not a world touched by simple rebellion. There were deeper, darker influences at work here. "My lord," Khan reported from the communication station, "the War Master requests your immediate presence aboard the Vengeful Spirit for strategic consultation." Angron nodded, but his expression was troubled. The invitation carried formal courtesy, but his empathic senses detected something beneath the surface, an eagerness that felt wrong, predatory in a way that had nothing to do with legitimate military planning. The flight to Horus's flagship gave Angron time to observe the assembled fleets with new clarity. The positioning was wrong for a standard orbital assault, he realized. The ships were arranged not to support a ground campaign, but to contain something. The formation spoke of siege tactics, of preventing escape rather than facilitating victory. Horus received him in his private chambers rather than the usual war room. Another departure from standard protocol that set Angron's newly awakened instincts on edge. The War Master looked different, still recognizably his brother, but carrying himself with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, his eyes reflecting depths that seemed familiar, yet fundamentally alien. "Angron," Horus said, his voice carrying its familiar warmth. But again, Angron's empathic senses detected layers beneath the surface. "You look well. The reports of your transformation have been remarkable." "The reports have been accurate," Angron replied carefully. "I am no longer the rage-consumed weapon I was. The question is whether that disappoints you." Horus's smile faltered for just a moment, so briefly that someone without empathic abilities might have missed it entirely. But to Angron, that flicker of disappointment was as revealing as a shouted confession. "Of course not," Horus said, but the lie carried emotional resonance that made Angron's skin crawl. "Your redemption is inspiring. It suggests possibilities that many of us had thought lost forever." The conversation that followed was a careful dance of words and half-truths, with Horus outlining the supposedly strategic situation on Istvan III, while Angron listened with growing horror to what his empathic senses revealed about his brother's true intentions. There was no rebellion on Istvan III, he realized. Or rather, there was, but it had been deliberately orchestrated to serve a different purpose entirely. The loyalist elements of the 4 legions were being positioned for slaughter, their deaths intended to serve as a sacrifice for something that Horus described in terms of necessary strategic restructuring, but which felt like corruption beyond anything Angron had previously encountered. "The virus bombing will commence at dawn," Horus said finally, and his words carried emotional undertones of anticipation that made Angron's newly healed soul recoil in horror. "A clean solution to a complex problem. The rebellious elements will be eliminated, and our legions will emerge stronger for having shed their weaker components." The euphemism was a thin veil over mass murder, and Angron's empathic abilities allowed him to feel the true depths of what Horus was planning. Not just the death of rebels, but the systematic elimination of any Legion members whose loyalty might prove inconvenient to whatever larger plan the War Master was pursuing. "You're talking about murdering our own sons," Angron said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made the air itself seem to thicken. "Men who have served faithfully for decades, whose only crime is maintaining loyalty to the Emperor, rather than to you personally." Horus's mask slipped entirely then, revealing something that might once have been Angron's brother, but had become something else. Something that carried the whispered promises of powers beyond the material realm. "The Emperor," Horus spat, and his voice carried harmonics that seemed to come from depths far below the surface of reality. "The tyrant who stole our potential, who denied humanity its true destiny. Yes, I plan to eliminate those too blind to see the truth of what we must become." The confession hung in the air between them like a blade. In that moment, Angron understood that he was not looking at his brother any more, but at something wearing his brother's face, something that had been touched by the same dark powers that had once whispered to him through the nails, but had chosen to embrace rather than resist their influence. "I will not be part of this," Angron said, rising from his chair with the fluid grace of someone whose every movement was now guided by clear intention rather than artificial rage. "Whatever you have become, Horus, whatever has corrupted you, I will not help you murder innocent men in service to it." Horus's expression shifted through surprise, anger, and finally a cold calculation that was perhaps the most terrifying thing Angron had ever seen on his brother's face. "You cannot stop this," Horus said with absolute certainty. "The virus bombing will proceed as planned. The loyalist elements will be eliminated. The galaxy will burn, and from that burning, something greater will emerge. The only choice you have is whether you stand with the future or cling to the failures of the past." "Then I choose the past," Angron replied without hesitation. "I choose loyalty to our father, service to humanity, and protection of those who cannot protect themselves. I choose to be the healer, rather than the destroyer." The confrontation might have escalated to violence then. Two Primarchs facing each other across an ideological gulf that no amount of brotherhood could bridge. But Horus was too cunning for immediate confrontation, and Angron too wise to waste his strength on a battle that would only serve his corrupted brother's purposes. "Leave," Horus said finally, his voice carrying the cold finality of someone who had just written another name on a very long list of enemies. "Return to your ship and prepare your legion for deployment. The bombing begins in 6 hours, whether you participate or not." Angron left the vengeful spirit with his mind racing through tactical possibilities. 6 hours to prepare for a betrayal that would reshape the entire galaxy. 6 hours to warn those who could be warned, to save those who could be saved, to choose what kind of Primarch he would be when the Imperium's greatest test finally arrived. The first thing he did upon returning to the Conqueror was send an emergency astropathic transmission to Terra, burning through psychic choir after psychic choir to ensure the message reached its destination, despite any attempt at interference. "Terra Actual from Primarch Angron. Stop Horus has turned. Traitor, stop virus bombing of loyalist forces. Imminent, stop request. Immediate strategic guidance. Stop Emperor. Be warned your son speaks with the voice of powers beyond the material realm. Stop." The second thing he did was activate every possible Vox channel to the other fleets in the system, broadcasting warnings to any who would listen about what was coming. Most of the transmissions were jammed or blocked, but some got through, enough to alert a few scattered units that something was terribly wrong. The third thing he did was prepare his own legion for a different kind of battle than any they had ever fought before. "We are going down to the surface," he told his assembled captains as alarms began to sound throughout the system. "But not to participate in the slaughter. We are going to save whoever we can." "My lord," Captain Erlen protested, his nails-enhanced aggression flaring at what he perceived as weakness. The War Master's orders were clear. "We are to support the operation." "The War Master's orders were an abomination," Angron replied, and his voice carried the absolute authority of someone who had finally found his true purpose. "We are world eaters, but we have never been murderers of our own. Today, we remember what we were meant to be." When the virus bombing began, it was Horus himself who gave the order, his voice carrying across the fleet communications with the cold satisfaction of someone executing a carefully planned betrayal. The weapons deployed were unlike anything in the standard Imperial arsenal, designed not just to kill, but to corrupt, to transform the very atmosphere of Istvan III into something that would poison anything it touched. But as the viral payload descended toward the planet's surface, it was met by something unprecedented in the history of such weapons: active resistance from one of the supposed Allied fleets. The World Eater's fleet, acting under Angron's direct command, began intercepting viral canisters with precision fire from their defensive batteries. They couldn't stop the bombing entirely, but they created safe zones, areas where Loyalist forces could take shelter, while Angron led rescue missions to extract survivors. The sight of the Red Angel, the former Eater of Cities, descending to Istvan III not to participate in slaughter, but to prevent it, would become one of the defining moments of the Horus Heresy. His healing abilities allowed him to treat even those touched by the viral weapons. His empathic senses guided him to survivors trapped in the chaos, and his transformed legion fought with a precision and purpose that had nothing to do with rage and everything to do with protecting the innocent. "This is Primarch Angron to all Loyalist forces," his voice echoed across the planet's surface as he led evacuation efforts under fire from his former allies. "Rally to designated extraction points. The World Eaters stand with the Emperor. We will get you out of this." For 6 hours, the Angel of Mercy waged war against the forces of corruption, saving lives instead of taking them, healing instead of destroying. When the last of the evacuation ships finally cleared Istvan III's poisoned atmosphere, they carried with them nearly 10,000 Loyalist survivors who would have otherwise died in the betrayal, men and women from 4 different legions who had been saved by a brother who had chosen compassion over corruption. But they also carried something else: absolute proof that the Horus Heresy had begun, and that the galaxy's greatest civil war would be fought along lines that no one had anticipated. The War Master had revealed himself, but so had the Angel of Mercy. The age of brotherhood was over, but the age of hope had just begun. The True Drop Site massacre, the strategic briefing aboard Ferrus Manus's flagship, had the grim efficiency of warriors preparing for what they all understood might be their final campaign. 4 Primarchs stood around the holographic display showing Istvan V's surface: Ferrus of the Iron Hands, Corax of the Raven Guard, Vulcan of the Salamanders, and Angron of the World Eaters. A year ago, the presence of the Red Angel at such a gathering would have been unthinkable. Now, he was their greatest hope for survival. "The intelligence from Istvan III survivors has been invaluable," Ferrus said, his voice carrying the metallic undertones that spoke of his extensive cybernetic augmentations. "We know now what Horus has become, what powers he serves. This will not be a conventional suppression action." Angron studied the tactical projections with sensors that could perceive layers of information invisible to normal sight. His empathic abilities, still developing since his liberation from the nails, painted the approaching battle in emotional colors that had nothing to do with tactical advantage and everything to do with the spiritual corruption they would face. 7 legions, Korax observed, his pale features marked by the shadows that always seemed to follow him. Even with advance warning, the numbers are against us. Numbers have never told the whole story, Vulcan rumbled, his massive frame radiating the quiet confidence that had made the salamanders legendary for their resilience. What matters is that we know the truth now. The second wave will not catch us unprepared. It was Angron who voiced what they were all thinking. The second wave will betray us regardless of preparation. The Word-bearers, Iron Warriors, Night Lords, and Alpha Legion, they have already chosen their side. The question is not whether the betrayal will come, but whether we can survive it long enough to extract our forces. The plan they developed over the following hours was unlike anything that had been attempted in the history of the Great Crusade. Instead of the traditional drop pod assault designed to achieve maximum shock and establish beachheads, they prepared for a fighting withdrawal, a deliberate strategy of engagement and extraction that would minimize casualties while achieving their objective of determining Horus's true strength. More importantly, Angron would serve not just as a combat commander, but as a source of psychological stability for forces that would be facing corruption beyond anything they had previously encountered. My empathic abilities have grown stronger since Istvon III, he explained to his fellow Primarchs. I can sense the taint of chaos influence, help our warriors resist the whispers and illusions that the enemy will undoubtedly employ. But more than that, he paused, considering how to explain something that even he was still learning to understand. I can heal not just physical wounds, but spiritual ones. The sight of brothers turned against brothers. The horror of facing corruption wearing familiar faces. These things wound the soul as much as any blade. I can help our forces endure what should be unbearable. The first sign that this would be unlike any previous campaign came during the initial orbital approach. Angron's empathic senses recoiled from the psychic atmosphere surrounding Istvan Fiv, detecting corruption that went beyond mere rebellion and into realms that should not exist in the material universe. The planet itself has been touched, he reported to the fleet commanders. Whatever powers Horus has embraced, they have changed the very nature of this place. Warn all personnel to be alert for psychological effects, confusion, unnatural fear, voices that seem to come from nowhere. The drop pod assault began at dawn, but unlike the historical massacre that might have been, the Loyalist forces descended with full knowledge of what awaited them. Angron led the World Eaters in a formation that prioritized protection over aggression, their landing pods configured for maximum survivability rather than maximum impact. The first hours of fighting proceeded almost according to the original plan. The Loyalist forces established their beachheads, engaged the supposedly rebellious forces on the surface, and began the systematic advance that should have led to the traitors' defeat. But Angron's presence changed everything about how that advance developed. Where Loyalist forces began to waver under the psychological pressure of fighting former allies, Angron was there, his healing abilities easing not just physical wounds, but the spiritual trauma of civil war. Where Space Marines began to succumb to whispered corruptions that promised power in exchange for betrayal, Angron's empathic presence provided an anchor of clarity that helped them resist. Hold fast. His voice carried across the Vox networks as the fighting intensified. Remember who you are, why you fight. The voices that whisper of easy victory and shared corruption are lies. Trust in your brothers, trust in your training, and trust that this darkness can be overcome. The effect on Loyalist morale was extraordinary. Instead of the gradual erosion of effectiveness that characterized most engagements against chaos-touched forces, the Iron Hands, Raven Guard, Salamanders and World Eaters fought with increasing coordination as the battle progressed. It was during the third hour of combat that Angron's empathic senses detected the approach of the second wave, but more importantly, detected the spiritual corruption that marked their true allegiances. "All units, this is Primarch Angron," he broadcast on emergency frequencies. "The second wave approaches, but they come as enemies, not allies. Repeat, Iron Warriors, Word Bearers, Night Lords, and Alpha Legion are hostile forces. Prepare for immediate tactical withdrawal to designated extraction points." The warning gave the Loyalist forces precious minutes to reposition, to shift from offensive operations to defensive extraction protocols. When the betrayal finally came, instead of catching them completely off guard, it met prepared resistance. The sight of Angron of the World Eaters standing alongside Ferrus Manus as the Iron Warriors' artillery began falling among Loyalist positions would become one of the defining images of the Horus Heresy. Not the Red Angel as an agent of destruction, but as a defender of his brothers against the very corruption that had once threatened to claim him as well. 7 against 4, Ferrus said grimly as they watched the traitor forces converge on their position. "Even with preparation, the mathematics are not in our favor." "Then we change the mathematics," Angron replied, his healing abilities already working to treat wounded warriors who should have been casualties. "We make every Loyalist worth 2 traitors. We make our survival so costly that even victory becomes defeat for them." What followed was 6 hours of the most intense combat any of them had ever experienced. But unlike the historical massacre, this was a fighting withdrawal conducted by forces that remained cohesive, commanded by Primarchs who could coordinate their efforts, and anchored by a healer whose very presence made the impossible seem achievable. The moment that would be remembered above all others came when Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children finally located Ferrus Manus among the extraction points. The confrontation between the two Primarchs should have ended with Ferrus's death, as it had in the original timeline. Instead, it became a 3-way battle as Angron intervened. "Brother," Angron called to Fulgrim as he interposed himself between the Phoenician and the Iron Hands Primarch. "I know you can feel it, the wrongness of what you have become. The blade at your side whispers lies. You can still choose a different path." Fulgrim's response was a scream of anguish that had nothing to do with physical pain and everything to do with the war being waged within his soul. The Lair Blade's influence was strong, but Angron's empathic abilities allowed him to reach the fragment of his brother's true self that still existed beneath the corruption. For a moment, just a moment, Fulgrim hesitated. In that hesitation, Angron struck not with his weapon, but with his healing touch, his power reaching out to the spiritual wounds that had made the corruption possible in the first place. The golden light that emanated from Angron's hands met the alien wrongness of the Lyre Blade, in a collision of opposing forces that sent shockwaves through both the material and immaterial realms. Fulgrim staggered, his perfect features contorting as two incompatible natures warred within his enhanced physiology. "I cannot!" Fulgrim gasped, his voice carrying harmonics that belonged to no human throat. "The blade, it has shown me truths that cannot be unseen, pleasures that cannot be unfelt." "Then let me show you different truths," Angron replied, his healing power pouring into his corrupted brother with all the strength he possessed. "Let me remind you of what you were before the corruption, what you could be again if you chose to fight it." The struggle lasted only seconds, but in those seconds, the entire trajectory of the heresy hung in the balance. If Angron could heal Fulgrim as he had been healed himself, if redemption was possible even for one who had already fallen. But the lair blade was ancient and cunning, and it had prepared for exactly this possibility. Drawing upon reserves of alien malevolence that predated humanity's rise, it fought back against Angron's healing influence with corruptions that were designed specifically to resist purification. Fulgrim's scream this time was one of pure agony, as two incompatible forces tore at his soul. The healing could not take hold while the blade remained, but the blade had integrated itself so deeply into his being that removing it might destroy him entirely. "I'm sorry, brother," Fulgrim whispered, tears of liquid silver streaming down his face. "I am too far gone. Save those who can still be saved." The Emperor's children. Primarch fled then, his enhanced speed carrying him away from the battle lines before Angron could attempt another healing intervention. Behind him, he left Ferrus Manus alive, and the extraction continuing according to plan. By the end of the 6th hour, what should have been a complete massacre had become something unprecedented, a tactical withdrawal that preserved the majority of 4 loyal legions while providing invaluable intelligence about the true scope of the corruption they faced. The final tally was staggering in its implications. Instead of the 90% casualties that had characterized the original drop site massacre, the Loyalist forces had suffered less than 40% losses. More than 60,000 Space Marines who should have died on Istvan Wafev lived to fight another day, their survival fundamentally altering the balance of forces for the civil war that was to come. But the real victory was not in numbers saved, but in proof provided. Angron had demonstrated that even the corruption of chaos could be resisted, that healing was possible even in the darkest circumstances, and that the choice between loyalty and treachery was not always irreversible. "The reports will reach Terra within days," Corax observed, as the surviving Loyalist fleets regrouped at the edge of the system. "The Emperor will know not just that Horus has turned, but that the corruption goes far deeper than simple rebellion. More importantly," Vulcan added, "he will know that we have found a way to fight it, that redemption is possible even for those who seem lost." Angron stood at the observation deck of the Conqueror, watching as the last of the evacuation ships cleared Istvan Phase's orbital space. The planet below them burned with fires that belonged to no natural chemistry, but they had proven that even such corruption could be opposed. "What happens now?" Khan asked, joining his Gene father at the viewport. "Now we prepare for the real war," Angron replied. "Horus has revealed himself. But we have revealed something as well. We have shown that his corruption is not inevitable, that there is an alternative to despair and betrayal." He paused, his empathic senses already reaching out toward the other Loyalist fleets, feeling the complex mixture of grief, hope, and determination that characterized warriors who had survived the unsurvivable. "The heresy has begun, but it will not end as the traitors expect. They planned for rage, for despair, for the inexorable spread of corruption. Instead, they face something they never anticipated, the power of healing applied as a weapon of war. The Angel of Mercy had proven himself in the crucible of the galaxy's greatest betrayal. What came next would test not just his abilities, but his faith in the possibility of redemption for a universe that seemed determined to tear itself apart. Behind them, Istvan 5 continued to burn. But ahead of them lay Terra, the Emperor, and the chance to prove that even the darkest of times could not extinguish the light of hope. The healer warriors stand. The reports reached Terra from across the galaxy, each more extraordinary than the last. On Mordian, the Angel of Mercy had cleansed an entire hive spire of chaos corruption, with nothing but his touch and the disciplined fury of his transformed World Eaters. On Cadia, he had faced down a greater daimon and sent it screaming back to the warp through the application of healing power that the entity could not comprehend. On Krieg, he had turned a world-ending chaos cult into a penitent population that now served as one of the most fanatically loyal imperial strongholds. Angron stood in the command center of the fortress world Chthoniya. Ironic that he should make his temporary headquarters on Horus's home world, studying tactical displays that showed the war's progress across hundreds of star systems. 3 years had passed since Istvan V, 3 years during which he had perfected techniques that no one had previously imagined possible. "My lord," Captain Khan reported as he entered the chamber. His own transformation from rage-driven berserker to thoughtful strategist, embodying the change that had swept through the World Eaters. The Ultramarines report successful completion of the Macragga defense. Lord Guilliman sends his thanks for the intervention at Calth. Angron nodded, remembering the desperate Vox transmission that had brought him and his fleet to the Ultramar system, just as word-bearer forces had begun their corruption rituals. The sight of the Red Angel arriving, not to join the attackers but to oppose them, had broken the morale of Lorgar's forces completely. More importantly, it had demonstrated something that was becoming a pattern across the galaxy. Chaos corruption could not only be resisted, but actively reversed through the proper application of healing power, combined with disciplined military action. "What news from the Fenris sector?" Angron asked, his empathic senses already reaching out to assess the emotional resonance of the reports flowing in from across the galaxy. The psychic network that connected him to loyalist forces had grown stronger over the years, allowing him to provide guidance and support even across vast interstellar distances. "The Space Wolves report that the demon incursion at Asserheim has been contained," Khan replied. "They applied the techniques you developed for purging corrupted material. Losses were minimal, and several fallen battle brothers were successfully restored to sanity." It was the restoration of fallen warriors that had perhaps proven most valuable in the long war against chaos. Traditional imperial doctrine held that any space marine touched by corruption was irredeemably lost, suitable only for execution or internment. Angron had proven that assumption false, developing methods to cleanse even deep-seated chaos, taint through a combination of psychic healing and what could only be described as spiritual surgery. The process was not always successful. Some forms of corruption had progressed too far to be reversed, and some warriors chose damnation over the difficult path of redemption. But the success rate was high enough to fundamentally alter how loyalist forces approached engagement with chaos-corrupted enemies. "Prepare the fleet for departure," Angron ordered as he studied the latest intelligence reports. "The situation at Moloch requires our immediate attention." Moloch, the night world where the Emperor himself had once walked, where ancient secrets lay buried beneath layers of official history. Intelligence suggested that Horus was moving significant forces toward the system, drawn by something that went beyond mere strategic value. The journey to Moloch took 2 weeks through increasingly dangerous warp currents, the tides of chaos growing stronger as the war's corruption spread across the galaxy. But Angron's presence on the fleet provided an anchor of stability that allowed them to navigate passages that should have been impossible for conventional vessels. "The warp itself recoils from your power," Sergeant Lork observed, as they watched reality reassert itself around their emergence point. "It's as if your healing abilities create zones of cleanliness that chaos cannot penetrate." Angron considered this, feeling the truth of it in his enhanced senses. His liberation from the nails had awakened abilities that went far beyond simple psychic healing. He was becoming something that the powers of chaos had never anticipated, a being capable of not just resisting corruption, but actively purifying it from the material realm. The battle for Moloch began before they reached orbit, as the planet's surface showed the telltale signs of large-scale chaos corruption. Entire continents glowed with unnatural fires, and the warp storms surrounding the world spoke of rituals being conducted on a scale that dwarfed anything previously attempted. "Horus is here," Angron announced, as their sensors detected the massive fleet holding position near the world's primary moon. And he has brought more than just military force. The engagement that followed was unlike any battle of the Horus Heresy. Instead of the usual clash of armies seeking tactical advantage, it became a contest between opposing philosophies made manifest in the material realm. Chaos sought to corrupt, to transform, to drag everything down to its level of spiritual degradation. Angron and his forces sought to heal, to restore, to prove that redemption was possible even in the darkest circumstances. The Space Marines who had served Horus the longest, those whose corruption had progressed furthest, proved immune to Angron's healing touch. But newer recruits, recent converts who had been seduced by promises of power rather than genuinely embracing damnation, found themselves wavering when faced with clear evidence that another path existed. "Brothers," Angron's voice carried across the battle lines, broadcast on frequencies that both sides could hear. "You were not born to serve entities that feed on suffering. You were created to protect humanity, to build rather than destroy, to bring light to the darkness rather than spread it further." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Entire squads of traitor Space Marines paused in their advance, their artificially enhanced aggression wavering as they remembered purposes that had been buried beneath layers of corruption and indoctrination. "Do not listen to him," came Horus's counter-broadcast, his voice carrying harmonics that belonged to no human throat. "He offers weakness disguised as strength, slavery disguised as freedom. I offer you the power to shape the galaxy according to your will." But the contest was no longer simply between competing arguments. It was between the spiritual aura that each Primarch now carried, Horus's corruption that promised power through submission to alien entities, and Angron's healing that demonstrated the possibility of genuine strength through redemption. When the two brothers finally met in single combat among the ruins of Moloch's primary hive, the confrontation sent shock waves through both the material and immaterial realms. Horus had become something beyond a mere Primarch, his body and soul infused with the power of all four Chaos gods. But Angron had become something equally unprecedented, a being touched by whatever force in the universe opposed corruption, whatever power sought to heal rather than destroy. "You could have stood with me," Horus said, as they circled each other among the burning ruins. "You could have embraced the truth of what we must become. Instead, you chose to cling to the Emperor's lies about peace and order." "I chose to become what I was meant to be," Angron replied, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "Not a weapon pointed by others, not a slave to artificial rage or alien whispers, but a healer who protects rather than destroys." Their battle lasted for hours, but it was not simply a contest of martial skill. It was a spiritual struggle between opposing natures, creation versus destruction, healing versus corruption, hope versus despair. Every blow that Horus struck carried the weight of chaos behind it, seeking to corrupt as well as damage. Every parry that Angron made was backed by healing power that sought to purify as well as protect. In the end, it was not superior combat ability that determined the outcome, but the fundamental difference in what each brother had chosen to become. Horus fought for powers that demanded submission and corruption as the price of strength. Angron fought for principles that required only the courage to choose healing over harm. When Horus finally retreated, pulling back his forces to regroup for the final assault on Terra, he left behind more than just a strategic defeat. He left behind proof that his corruption was not inevitable, that redemption was possible even for those who seemed completely lost. "The reports of Moloch will reach every corner of the galaxy," Khan observed, as they watched the traitor fleets withdraw. "Loyalist forces will know that you faced the War Master himself and proved that his power is not absolute." Angron stood among the ruins of what had once been a magnificent city, his healing abilities already working to cleanse the corruption from the stone itself. Where his power touched, the unnatural fires died out, replaced by something that looked remarkably like hope. "More importantly," he said, watching as former traitors who had chosen redemption during the battle worked alongside his World Eaters to tend the wounded, "they will know that choice itself is a weapon against chaos, that no matter how far someone has fallen, they can still choose to rise again." The legend that had begun on Genna, grown at Istvan Fafef, and been confirmed at Moloch, was now spreading across the galaxy faster than even astropathic communication. The Red Angel reborn, the Angel of Mercy, the healer warrior who had proven that redemption was possible even in the darkest times. As the World Eater's fleet prepared to depart Moloch, bound for Terra and the final confrontation that would determine the galaxy's fate, Angron felt the weight of that legend settling around him like a mantle of responsibility. He had become something that no one had anticipated, not just a weapon against chaos, but a symbol of hope for anyone who believed that healing was possible. Behind them, Moloch began to heal, its corruption cleansed, its people restored to sanity, its cities already showing signs of reconstruction. Ahead of them lay Terra, where the Emperor waited for news of his son's transformation, and where the final test of redemption's power would soon be written in fire and blood across the birth world of humanity itself. The Angel of Mercy had proven that even the greatest corruption could be opposed. Now he would have the chance to prove that it could be defeated entirely, that the choice between hope and despair was one that every soul could make for themselves. The galaxy was burning, but for the first time since the Heresy began, that fire carried light as well as heat, the light of healing, of redemption, of the possibility that even the darkest night could give way to dawn. The price of redemption. Terra burned, but not as it should have. Angron stood upon the walls of the Imperial Palace, watching traitor fleets descend through the planet's tortured atmosphere like falling stars bent on destruction. The siege of Terra had begun 3 days ago, but already it was clear that this would be unlike any battle in human history. The Loyalist defenses were stronger than they had ever been in the original timeline, reinforced by 60,000 survivors from Istvan V, bolstered by techniques for fighting chaos corruption, and anchored by the presence of the Angel of Mercy himself. But strength of arms was not the only difference. The very nature of the conflict had changed. Where once this would have been a simple siege between loyalist and traitor forces, it had become something far more complex. A spiritual battlefield where the power of redemption clashed directly with the forces of corruption. "My lord," Captain Khan approached, his voice carrying the weight of terrible news. "The enemy has deployed the other World Eaters." Angron closed his eyes, feeling the psychic resonance of his fallen sons as they took position among the traitor forces. These were the World Eaters who had refused transformation, who had chosen to embrace the nail's artificial rage rather than accept the difficult path of healing. Over the years since his liberation, they had been recruited by Horus, their loyalty purchased with promises that their suffering would be validated, their pain transformed into a weapon against those who had abandoned them. "How many?" Angron asked. though he already knew the answer would break what remained of his heart. 4 companies, perhaps 3,000 Marines. Khan's voice was carefully controlled, but Angron could feel his oldest friend's grief through their psychic bond. Led by Captain Erlen and Delvarus, they call themselves the True Eaters now. The irony was bitter beyond measure. In choosing healing, Angron had saved thousands of his sons, but in that same choice he had lost others, warriors who interpreted his transformation as a rejection of everything they had suffered for, everything they had sacrificed in his name. They hate you more than they hate the Emperor, Khan continued quietly. Erebus and his chaplains have convinced them that your redemption was a lie, that you betrayed the very essence of what made the World Eaters unique. Through his empathic senses, Angron could feel the True Eater's rage burning like a beacon of corruption across the battlefield. It was familiar and alien at the same time, the same artificial fury that the Nails had forced upon him for decades, but now freely chosen and willingly embraced. They had taken his former slavery and made it their identity. The first assault came at dawn, not against the palace walls, but against Angron's position specifically. The True Eaters had requested, demanded, the right to face their former Gene father in personal combat, and Horus had been more than willing to grant that request. As Angron descended to meet them in the ruins of what had once been the palace's eastern gardens, he was accompanied by visions that struck his consciousness like physical blows. The powers of chaos, desperate to break the symbol of redemption that he had become, showed him images of what he might have been. The demon Prince of Khorne, reveling in eternal slaughter, his pain transformed into a weapon that could reshape reality itself. The visions were seductive in their completeness. As a demon prince, his suffering would have had meaning. His rage would have served a purpose beyond mere destruction. He could have been a god of war, feared and worshipped across the galaxy, his every victory a vindication of the pain that had defined his existence. Instead, he had chosen to heal, to forgive, to become something that the galaxy had never seen before, a Primarch who saved rather than destroyed, who built rather than broke, who chose compassion over conquest. Was it worth it? Captain Erlen stood at the center of the True Eaters formation, his nails gleaming like a crown of thorns around his scarred skull. All those years of pain, all that suffering, was throwing it away worth the Emperor's approval? I did not throw it away, Angron replied, his voice carrying across the battlefield with supernatural clarity. I transformed it. I chose to become something greater than my suffering. You chose weakness, Delvarus spat, raising his chainsword in challenge. You chose to deny what the Nails made us, the perfect warriors, freed from the limitations of conscience and mercy. The battle that followed was unlike any combat Angron had ever experienced. He fought not just against his fallen sons, but against visions of what he might have become, against whispers that promised it was not too late to embrace the power that chaos still offered. Every blow from the True Eaters carried the weight of accusation, that his healing had been a betrayal of everyone who had suffered alongside him. But as the combat intensified, something unexpected began to happen. Angron's healing abilities, now fully developed through years of practice, began to affect even the True Eaters. Where his power touched them, the artificial rage of the Nails flickered and wavered, allowing glimpses of the men they had once been beneath the manufactured fury. No, Erlen gasped, as golden light played across his scarred features, momentarily quieting the Nails' constant whisper. We chose this. We chose to honor our pain, rather than abandon it. You chose to remain slaves, Angron replied sadly, his healing power reaching out not in attack but in offering. The nails were never your strength, my sons. They were your chains. I am offering to break them. The psychic shockwave that followed was felt across the entire battlefield. For the first time since taking the nails, the True Eaters experienced a moment of genuine choice, the possibility of freedom from the artificial rage that had defined them for so long. Some chose healing. Captain Varn of the assault squads fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face as he felt his natural emotions return for the first time in decades. "My lord," he whispered, I had forgotten what it felt like to choose." Others chose their chains. Erlen and Delverus, their identities too deeply tied to their suffering to accept liberation, fought against the healing power with every fiber of their being. They would rather die as slaves than live free. But the most terrible choice came when the traitor forces deployed their ultimate weapon, corrupted world eaters who had been transformed into chaos spawn, their humanity stripped away by powers that fed on suffering. These had once been Angron's sons, and now they were monstrosities that existed only to spread pain and corruption. "Choose," Horus's voice echoed across the battlefield, carrying the malevolent satisfaction of someone who believed he had found an unwinnable scenario. "Save Terra, and allow your corrupted sons to spread their taint across the galaxy, or save them and watch the Imperium burn." For a moment that lasted an eternity, Angron stood frozen between impossible alternatives. Then he did something that no one, not Horus, not the Chaos Gods, not even the Emperor himself, had anticipated. He chose both. The healing power that erupted from Angron in that moment was unlike anything that had ever been seen in the material realm. It reached out not just to his corrupted sons, but to every soul touched by chaos on the battlefield, traitor and loyalist alike, demon and human, corrupt and pure. It offered redemption to any who would accept it, healing to any who would embrace it, hope to any who could remember what it meant to choose light over darkness. The effort nearly killed him. Angron collapsed to his knees as years of life force poured out of him. His healing abilities stretched beyond any reasonable limit in an attempt to save everyone: the corrupted, the loyal, the fallen, and the pure. But it worked. Across the battlefield, Chaos Spawn began to revert to human form, their corruption burned away by healing light. Demon engines fell silent as their machine spirits chose freedom over slavery. Even some of the traitor Primarchs felt the touch of redemption, though most were too far fallen to accept it. The True Eaters, faced with the ultimate proof of their Gene Father's love, that he would sacrifice himself to save even those who hated him, finally understood what redemption truly meant. Not the denial of suffering, but its transformation into something greater. "Father," Erlen whispered, as the nails finally fell silent in his skull, "forgive us. We chose poorly." "There is nothing to forgive," Angron replied, his voice weak but filled with infinite compassion. "You are my sons. You will always be my sons, regardless of the choices you make." The siege of Terra continued for 7 more days, but its outcome was never again in doubt. The demonstration of redemption's power had broken the spiritual foundation upon which the rebellion was built. Traitor forces began surrendering in unprecedented numbers, choosing healing over corruption, hope over despair. When Horus himself finally fell, not to the Emperor's sword, but to the weight of his own choices when faced with undeniable proof that redemption was possible, the Heresy ended not with the galaxy's division, but with its healing. The cost had been enormous, Angron survived his great sacrifice, but he was forever changed. His life force diminished, his physical form weakened by the effort of healing an entire battlefield. He would never again be the warrior he had once been, but he had become something far greater. Proof that love could triumph over hate, that healing could overcome corruption, that even in the darkest times, hope could light the way to redemption. In the years that followed, the galaxy slowly healed from the wounds of civil war. The techniques Angron had developed for fighting chaos corruption spread throughout the Imperium, creating a new class of warrior healers who served as both soldiers and spiritual guides. The World Eater's Legion was reformed, but with a new purpose, not as destroyers, but as protectors, not as weapons of war, but as instruments of peace. And in the depths of the Imperial Palace, in a chamber set aside for quiet reflection, Angron would often sit with those he had saved, former traitors and loyalists alike, united by the shared understanding that redemption was not just possible but necessary for anyone who wished to truly serve humanity. Was it worth it? Visitors would sometimes ask, seeing his weakened form and knowing what he had sacrificed. Angron would smile then, the expression lighting up features that had once known only rage and pain. "Ask me that question in 100 years," he would say, "when you see what this galaxy becomes when its people choose healing over hatred, when they choose to build rather than destroy, when they remember that even the most broken souls can be made whole again." The Red Angel had found his true purpose at last, not as a weapon of destruction, but as a testament to the power of redemption. The galaxy would remember his name, not for the worlds he had conquered, but for the souls he had saved, including his own. In choosing to heal rather than harm, Angron had not just changed his own fate, he had changed the fate of the entire galaxy, proving that even in the darkest timeline, hope could still find a way to shine through. The price of redemption had been everything he had to give. But the reward, a galaxy where healing was possible, where corruption could be overcome, where love could triumph over hate, had made every sacrifice worthwhile. The Angel of Mercy had kept his promise. He had saved them all.